welcome to the fifth and the very last day of the Future of Work in the New Normal Conference, jointly organized by Research for Social Advancement, RESA, and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, FES, in Asia. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. My name is Farhana Roslan, and I am the MC for today, and also a visiting researcher at RESA. Today, we will be talking about the labor perspective, and this is actually the last session after we went through the bigger picture on Monday, and then following that on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, where we explored the youth perspective, the company's perspective, as well as the youth perspective, the company perspective, and the gig economy. And so it's only fair that today we will culminate the discussion into the labor perspective, because we cannot escape the discussion of labor and jobs in all these other discussions. But before that, let me first share with you the recap, a short recap of what we discussed yesterday in day 4 in the youth perspective. Mr. Lee Hock Wan from Malaysia gave an overview of the prevailing issues in the labor market in Malaysia, which mainly revolves around the supply and demand mismatch, where there's an increase in graduation rate, but then there's a decrease in job openings. And so this demands a deep analysis as to why this mismatch is happening. And of course, there's this undisputed trend in increase of self-employment manifested in the form of the gig economy. It comes with a whole host of issues, which we have mainly discussed and touched upon in all of the 4 days prior to today, including the lack of social protection, the precariousness, instability of the job, and also the lack of ability to skill build and receive training in these jobs. Malaysia also need to move out of the low wage, low skill labor intensive, but also we have to be careful to not overemphasize on e-commerce and rather look at the crafts and manufacturing sectors that cannot be ignored. And then Mr. Buma Yudhisthira gave the perspective of the youth in Indonesia. And the main issue surrounding that is that, interestingly, the government in Indonesia is planning on a reversal of a labor policy back to the 1980s style of low-skilled worker sector jobs to attract foreign direct investment, which has manifested in the recent very contentious passing of the draft law, the omnibus law. And what we learned from Mr. Bima yesterday was that despite the demographic bonus is having a huge young population in Indonesia, the purported digital boom is not really trickling down in a fair and equal way across all the youth in Indonesia, because there are people in the advantaged and disadvantaged positions to take advantage of the digital boom. Similarly, Ms. Hamti Tulan gave the perspective of the youth in Vietnam, where there's a very similar situation in Malaysia and Indonesia. The precariousness of the job arrangements for the youth, which mainly involve low wages, lack of social protection, dangerous working conditions under during the COVID-19 situation, typically in the food delivery sector. And this form of non-standard employment really is more likely to transition to unemployment rather than the purported benefits of these non-standard employment towards en route to stable employment. And the education sector in Vietnam also is not ready to prepare the youth to enter the job market needed for Work 4.0, even though we're talking about IR, Industrial Revolution 4.0. As a result, there's a lot of overqualified youth working in low-skill jobs, and this is very much similar, echoed by the speakers from Malaysia and Indonesia as well. Interestingly, the Vietnamese youth population involved in the gig employment are much less organized in trade unions or sort of grab sort of unions, such as in Malaysia and Indonesia. We cannot escape the issue of this self-employment and new gig economy, and I think today we'll be touching on that a lot. And particularly in the youth perspective, the speakers yesterday talked about how it's good, it's good that we have the gig economy as a temporary solution, but really the development of skills and protection are very much imperatives in the long term. One of the paradox in Malaysia is that most, 40% of those who started up business in the digital technology sector actually use funding from family. Only 25% startup use money from their own savings, and only 20% go to the banks for loans. And so this shows that this digital boom is actually not felt equally across all income levels and people in the disadvantaged and advantaged situations in terms of youth. Similarly, Indonesia, ironically, has the fifth largest startup population in the world, with more than 2,000 startups but the local talent simply cannot compete with the expatriates that the government is bringing in to fill in the gaps in the high-skilled digital technology labor requirements under the Omnibus Law. So these are definitely very, very interesting perspectives from across the ASEAN region. And of course, we will be looking forward to hear more from the speakers today. Of course, we also cannot remove ourselves from the issue of wages when we talk about precarious employment in the wake of COVID. A lot of the speakers echoed that, even before the pandemic, even before a situation where a lot of people lost their jobs, youth in Malaysia, for example, are enjoying as low as only 1,500 ringgit, which is about just shy of $400 median wage for those between 20 to 24, and not even those between 15 to 24, and also experiences the slowest growth rate. So this was one of the biggest revelations that we found yesterday in the session. And in fact, more than 85% of these people who work in self-employment actually earn less than $500. Indonesians, on the other hand, have to overwork to survive. Almost 30% of workers in Indonesia work more than 49 hours a week, where Indonesia is internationally ranked number 3 in the most populous population involved in hard labor. Vietnamese youth also, as spoken by Ms. Pham, face among the lowest wages across the age groups in Vietnam. And so there is a need for the government to take the high road towards a high income, high skill coupled with work-life balance. So there is a lot of talk recently over the last 2 days in the conference about ASEAN countries, racing to the bottom, and especially women and youth are most affected, especially in Indonesia, as discussed yesterday. And the overall recommendations that we found from our discussion yesterday in the youth perspective was that there needs to be this overall new mindset or ethos on the concept of work. There's fundamental questions that the government need to ask, especially in providing and thinking about the labor market and the jobs for the youth. And these are, what are really the role of jobs? Is it just to provide money for a short-term livelihood, or is it, what about the questions, ethical considerations of dignity, quality, productivity of those jobs, providing decent work and work-life balance? And our speaker, Bima from Indonesia, interestingly introduced this dual-pronged strategy that he proposed to the Indonesian government, where he recommends that there should be a two-path for the mobilization of R&D funding and investments by either governments or the foreign direct investors to support the development of the high-skilled labor for the graduate population of Indonesia, whereas a better scheme for youth would be the link and match schemes, which he recommends to be low, people people with low qualifications and youth with semi-skilled to find jobs in the market using internet platforms, and also to market their products for people, the youth with more entrepreneurial streak to them. And of course, in Vietnam also, Ms. Pham recommended, a much greater collective action like other countries among the youth in Vietnam, with the international commitment to, seriously look into regulating employment and labor laws to look at this new class of workers, which are neither clients, self-dependent. They are very much dependent on the apps and the ride-hailing apps, for example, but also not enjoying the benefits of a full-time employment. So without further ado, I'd like to let me stop sharing the screen now. I would like to now introduce our speakers for today. Today, session 5, we have a very good set of speakers. Mr. Apolinar Z. Tolentino, which is the Asia Pacific Regional Representative at Building and Woodworkers International BWI in Malaysia, as well as Ms. Annie Santiago, which is a lawyer practicing in Malaysia. Hi, Ms. Annie.
Hello, hi.
Hi, thank you for saying hi. It's nice to hear your voice. There is also Mr. Hidayat Greenfield with the Asia Pacific Regional Secretary, International Union of Food, Agriculture, Hotel, Restaurant, Catering, Tobacco, and Allied Workers Associations, IUF. And today we will be moderating the Mr. Rajiv Rishayakaran, which is our very own state legislative assembly person of the constituency of Bukit Gasing and Selangor, which is a state in Malaysia, who will be moderating our session today. Without further ado, may I pass on the floor to Rajiv. Thank you so much for moderating today, and let's have a good conference.
All right. Thank you, Farhana, for doing a good job in giving us a good recap of what has happened yesterday. Useful for those who are not able to join, including myself. And thank you to all the speakers for agreeing to spend your time with us this afternoon to share with us your experiences. What we will do is we will give each speaker about 15 minutes to share with us their presentation, and then we will go into a discussion for about an hour. So I look forward to hearing your questions. As the speakers are giving their presentations, you can type in your questions as you get them, and we will try to get as many of them answered or discussed during the 1 hour of discussion following the presentations. So to get things moving, I would like to invite Mr. Hidayat Greenfield to share with us your thoughts on the future of work.
Okay, thank you, Rajiv. And I'd just like to also thank Farhana for that recap of the youth perspective. And I might just start with that, because I think that these are absolutely critical, probably the most critical issues in terms of the future of work. And I can see many similarities with what our young members face across the IUF sectors. But I think one of the interesting things is that it shows that while the COVID-19 pandemic has clearly accelerated the use of new technologies and changed how people live fundamentally, I think quite permanently, it has accelerated technological change in ways that I think most people find hopeful. We agree with that. But I think it's important to understand that the technological transformation is being introduced in a way that doesn't create new opportunities for youth, for workers, and transform their lives. The technological transformation as it's occurring today is being layered on top of existing insecurity, informal sector, and vulnerability. And I will talk a little bit about this layering. And I think that's a real challenge. And I think that is, to some extent, why there's such a problem with the gig economy and the benefits for young workers, is because it doesn't create take the informal to the formal sector with social protection and government support. It basically takes the vulnerability and insecurity of the informal sector, taps that, and basically adds a layer of technology. And so I want to talk about a little bit about that and what it means. But I do want to acknowledge that today is World Food Day. It's very significant for us as a union that represents agriculture and food workers, so October 16. And we've launched, we do have a statement that can be shared with you about World Food Day and the coming global food crisis. The United Nations said in July already, we face the biggest global food crisis in 50 years. But the relevance to this discussion is that the workers that plant, harvest, prepare, and serve food are the most undervalued workers in the world across the board. And so we have to consider, when we talk about the future of work, this issue of the value of work, and why there's a disconnect between the contribution that workers will make to society. For example, farm and agricultural fishery workers contributing to society in the biggest global food crisis in 50 years. Their contribution has intrinsic value, but it doesn't have recognized economic and financial value. It doesn't translate into decent wages and good working conditions. And I think that's very important to understand why. The primary reason is because the value of work is not related to skills, potential, and possibilities. The value of work is related to vulnerability. It's still locked into vulnerability, and we have to break that. And I'll explain, hopefully, if we have time towards the end, how we might do that. But basically, the vulnerability I'm talking about is, for example, discrimination based on gender and race. That's very embedded in the systemic patriarchy and racism that defines our economic systems. And so if you look at the work done by women and if you look at the work done by migrant workers, it's significantly undervalued. And that's directly related. There's a causal relationship between vulnerability and the value of work. The more vulnerable the worker, the lower the value of work. It's not connected to skills in any way. For example, in this global pandemic, it's very clear that hotel housekeeping is such a vital frontline job. Health and hygiene is an absolute priority. This is an essential job, and yet remains outsourced, underpaid, undervalued, and decidedly classified as unskilled. And so we struggle with understanding how international hotel companies are reopening hotels now in several countries in the region, and yet housekeepers' conditions haven't changed at all. They're doing vital work. It's recognized by the companies when they tell customers this is a safe hotel, but the value of that work hasn't changed at all. And I think that's because it is so much built into the vulnerability of the workers who do that work, mainly women and migrant workers. Concretely, and it's clear that in this pandemic, companies were already planning automation and new technologies, but the pandemic has accelerated. And we've talked to, in representing our members, talking to a lot of global food and dairy companies and beverage companies, trying to find a way through this crisis. In our discussions, they have all talked about adopting automation and new technology more quickly, fast tracking what was in the pipeline. And one of the things I'd like to share, and it relates a little bit to the youth perspective that there was a recap of yesterday, but much of what was discussed this week about skills training and reskilling. The companies show that as they have more automation and new technologies, there is a shift from what they call technical skills, which we would understand as skills, and soft skills. And it's very difficult to understand this because soft skills is not skills developed based on STEM education, for example, as you might hope. Soft skills is attitude and behavior. They list a series of soft skills that is essentially openness, willingness, attitude, and have downgraded and phased out technical skills, abilities that you would learn through any kind of training. What the soft skills, the way the soft skills work with the new technology is the willingness, openness to work all day with a smartphone or tablet being told what to do. Minute by minute, task by task. There are remote operators, technicians, and specialists who will then manage several people in other countries and tell them what to do. And you hold up your tablet, you point it at the machine, you point it at the product, and you're told what to do. You're not taught what to do. You're given instructions constantly all day. This was presented to us by more than one company as the future of work. And so this is really challenging because if you come back to the premise that technology is layered on top of existing vulnerability, what happens when that attitude is judged in very subjective ways? So let me come to a concrete example. On Sunday, we had a very good discussion as part of the IUF Asia Pacific initiative called Women, Unions and Power. We had a discussion with women leaders in Pakistan in food and beverage industries. And they talked about all of the new technology coming in very quickly now, creating stress, additional work, pressure, and a lot of conflict with their supervisors and managers. But a common thread throughout different companies of what the new technology is a lot of technology to track and trace, not movements for COVID-19, but movement of product, movement of workers, and tracking that is basically built, aimed at identifying individual responsibility for each worker. So now, if there's any problem in delays, errors, loss and breakage, it's tracked immediately to an individual worker. And that then translates into punishment and warnings and so on. Fine, in and of itself, that could be, you could cope with that. But the problem is we have patriarchy and racism. So you already have inbuilt discrimination and bias. So if you take the individual responsibility and blame, a system of technology developed to identify individual workers and attribute blame, then as our women leaders and members said, they will find more harassment, more discrimination, and more vulnerability to sexual harassment, for example, with their male supervisors and managers. There'll just be more punishment. They'll identify them individually and directly. You take migrant workers, same thing, more marginalization and discrimination. And of course, workers in insecure jobs, a lot of young workers in precarious employment, you're basically looking at the company not renewing your contract because you made the mistake that was tracked to you. And those are the kinds of discussions we had. What it tells us, whether that happens or not, and we'll discuss whether that happens, What it tells us is that technology intersects with power, and the power relations that shape vulnerability haven't changed. That hasn't changed at all. In fact, the global crisis around COVID-19 has deepened this vulnerability, as we saw in the video in previous discussions this week. And it's very important. So when we look at technology, we're not rejecting it, but we're questioning its use and questioning how the technology intersects with vulnerability and insecurity, gender and race. And the United Workers Union, Lauren Kelly at the United Workers Union produced an excellent report called Technology and Power, and the link will be shared with you, I think. And in this report, they show that actually most of the technology being introduced is for surveillance. That's the primary use of the technology. And secondly, technology introduced to manage a very flexible workforce, which means precarious and insecure jobs. It doesn't in any way make the work safer, better, or more meaningful, which is, I think, a real challenge. So where that leaves us, and if you allow me, Rajiv, just to wrap up, where it leaves us is I think, coming back to a question of rights. What I think we need to do, and this was touched on, I think, earlier in other sessions, is we need to reaffirm the rights that should determine the social transformation that works hand in hand with the technological change. We have to have a change in social demands and social goals to define the technology that's adopted, not the other way around. We can't gear education towards what companies need. We develop the education programs and needs of society, and they respond to that. Fundamentally, it's about human rights, and I think it's good to remind ourselves that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23(1), establishes the right to work in a favorable environment. The right to work is a human right, a universal human right. You can work freely under favorable conditions and earn a decent living. In 2005, it would have been the Committee on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights. Its comment number 8, I think, explained that this is so fundamentally important, the right to work, because it enables us to access our other rights, human rights, and as a package then live a life with dignity. And I think this is the critical thing, and the word dignity is used many times this week. But you can't get that dignity in the future of work if you can't access your rights, your right to work under good conditions, and the right to have job security and safe work. And this leads us to the very fundamental right, which is the labor response, if you like. You must have the right to freedom of association. And the problem for the gig economy, young workers and workers in many of our sectors, and the agricultural workers who are feeding the world but not able to feed themselves today, the problem is they don't have the right to freedom of association, to come together collectively in a union to protect their interests. If you have the right to freedom of association, as our sisters in Pakistan show, they're unionized. So they take on this issue of the threat of new technology to them, the discrimination and bias that will intersect with it, and they respond positively. They have put together a proposal of a charter of demand for technological rights, and they will negotiate the change. And that's what we need to rebalance the power. We need freedom of association to tackle vulnerability, to eliminate gender discrimination and racism. We need the right of freedom of association to be able to counterbalance the power as new technology comes in. It's the only way to ensure that the future of work is a future with dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Hidayat. That's a very good start to our discussion today. And I see that the comments are starting to flow in, and very good to see that. We can also use the Q&A function that's available to post the questions here, besides putting them in chat, to ensure that we don't lose track of things. But next, let's invite Apolina Tolentino to share with us your perspective on this topic. Apolino, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, I can hear you quite well.
Thank you for the invitation to be part of this webinar conference. Good afternoon to my co-panelists and speakers. As a start, let me acknowledge the contribution of the frontline workers in this COVID outbreak, and particularly for those who have sacrificed their lives in the line of duty. It's important that we recognize them as we discuss this conference topics. I actually have a slide, but it's an attempt to give you an idea on how the BWI is actually responding in terms of the challenges of COVID and of course in relation to the future of work. I hope you can see the slide. We at the height of the COVID managed to consult our affiliates and in a way came up with this declaration. It has 7 pillars. Pillar number 3 is particularly, for example, referring to migrant workers, which in the guide questions that we have received actually asked us to discuss or focus significantly on migrant workers as I will go along. I leave it there for the time being. The COVID-19 pandemic has actually further unmasked or exposed the bankrupt neoliberal economic model worldwide. Starting from the structural adjustment program in the 70s, near 80s, further liberalization and privatization of utilities, health and medical facilities, for example, really underscore the failure of the current economic architecture. Once the outbreak has unleashed its impact, you can see the saturation, the exhaustion of hospitals, clinics that cannot cope up with the demands to cater for sick and those who need checkup even. For so long decades, for example, in the Philippines, the migration of nurses, doctors to many countries of destination, North America, and recently in the Gulf countries have shown the limited number of personnel attending to the vast requirement of the challenges of COVID-19. And that brings me actually to one of the guide questions asking like, what is the social security adjustment needed for this new normal scenario or the current setup as maybe we can say now. Obviously, we need a robust social security policies and programs. This will underscore what we have been doing in the unions for so long a time, calling or even demanding for access to affordable healthcare, access to paid sick leaves and sickness benefits, protecting workers during unemployment, just like what we experienced, and providing income support in the form of cash transfers and other benefits as key components for policy responses to COVID-19. Various social protection mechanisms should be used in combination to other progressively build universal protection system. There is a call for universal social security, even setting up a fund for it. And at the national level, social protection floors should guarantee at least basic level of protection to all, including emergency healthcare for migrants, irrespective of their status. And I'll give a concrete example about this policy statement very recently. The trade union had been persistent and calling on the need for Malaysia government, for example, in terms of its commitment to ILO Convention 19. It's equality of treatment for accident compensation. Because for a time, I would rather say for some time, the migrant workers were included, but in the course, they were removed from the system. And through the consistent pressure in the ILO, for example, Malaysia this year decided to have the system available to about 2.2 million migrant workers. I mean, in a way, it provided the migrant workers in the advent of COVID a good social security coverage because of this sustained work of the trade union. Um, it, it was announced by the Social Security Organization of Malaysia that it will bear costs of COVID screening of migrant workers because they are contributing to the funds. That is a good example that the union had worked on. Another important question is about in what kind of work culture we need aside from having a robust social security policies and program. In the BWI, aside from this part of the declaration is our line saying that the health and safety everyday culture that we have to imbibe, we have to practice and propagate. As workplaces are changing with the physical distancing requirements becoming a norm, it is more important that we promote specific occupational safety and health protocols in workplaces. It has to be changed. I mean, in construction work sites, for example, even the time of reporting on duty, ingress, egress, how many people can use the lift, and even access and time of to mess to have lunch or a tea break, for example, have to be restructured at the same time. Similarly, while we are promoting particular protocols or guidelines on workplaces, the unions are strongly, again, demanding for the classification of COVID-19 as an occupational disease and relating it to the ILO Convention 155. In Asia, in ASEAN country, for example, of the 10, we found out that only 4 actually have so far classified COVID-19 as an occupational disease in varying degrees. Again, if we look at Malaysia, it announced that COVID-19 is occupational disease, rightly because COVID is a variant of SARS, as we all know, and SARS is already classified as occupational disease. And in that regard, Philippines, for example, has included SARS in its employment compensation list of or schedule of occupational diseases. It also announced publicly that frontline workers who had contracted COVID-19 are entitled for compensation and so on. And Singapore and Brunei somehow, but not so clear, have a reference on SARS, respiratory diseases, as an occupational disease. This is a matter of pushing it further to have at least, if we look at ASEAN member states, for example, to classify COVID-19 as an occupational disease. And there are some arguments saying, how can you have the causal link whether the worker or workers actually got the infection from the work site? It's very clear in ILO Convention 155. The broad definition of workplace is not just construction work sites, not just restaurants or hotel rooms or bank office. It includes the transport to and from your workplace. So the classification of the disease is well established scientifically, but the causal link is also arguably defined by ILO Convention 155. At the same argument, we are calling for free COVID testing for all workers. It's absurd for some countries that are too expensive, inaccessible, even for testing alone. An example, there was a joint memorandum of the Department of Labor and the Department of Trade and Industry in the Philippines saying that it's free testing for workers. But when we look at the specific clause of the memorandum, actually it says highly encouraged. So in the media, it's a propaganda saying it's free, but if you look at the text, where there will be a good argument, is say highly encouraged. So we have to really look into the details of the policies that being promulgated by government in terms of testing and access of workers for COVID-related diseases. And of course, the importance overall of the stimulus package. I just look at the statistics today to have an idea for how serious the countries are in providing economic stimulus package in terms of the GDP ratio, for example. Japan, I think it's the highest, 21.1%. India, 6.9% ratio of its DGP. Indonesia, 4.4. Philippines, 4.2 in last quarter of this year. And this gives us an idea on how much, for example, in the video saying, is it enough in terms of the economic package or subsidies or paid leaves that workers can get. Maybe I have to stop here for a while if that is already meeting my 10 minutes per round. Right?
Yeah, 1 more minute left if you have a last
that's all right. Yeah, I'll leave it there for two important issues, and then we can come back later on. Yeah, thank you for the time.
Thank you, Apolinar, and for giving us your perspectives on this. We have Annie Santiago, a lawyer, with us now to share her perspectives on the labor response. Annie, are you there?
Yeah, can you see me?
All right. Yes, we can see you.
Great. Yeah,
hear
thank
you.
you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'm so, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm very happy to share the experiences of the Malaysian labor perspective. And I think some of the areas that has been covered by the first and second speaker, so it makes it a little easier for me now, since those areas have already been covered. I would like to, what I will focus is on the labor laws in Malaysia and how it curtails the right to association. I'll go into the second area of migrant workers. And I will also like to look at some examples of best practices related to social protection, and also provide some kind of recommendation of how we can move together to shape or recover better in the new normal. So taking on the first point in the questions that was given, in terms of how could worker organization preserve their bargaining power, what role can trade unions play in this transformation process? I believe the first speaker has clearly also said, the freedom of association is, I stand corrected, but I think this is what I understood from him. The freedom of association is severely curtailed. And I would like to say that in Malaysia, the labor laws severely curtail the right to association of workers. Less than 10% of the Malaysian labor force is unionized due to the restrictive nature of the Malaysian labor laws, which was promulgated in the years 1959 and 1967. And this has stunted the growth of trade unions. And most of these trade unions are in industries, and collective agreements which have been which has received cognizance from the industrial court continue to maintain the industrial relations between companies and trade unions. What I understand is that Malaysian Trade Union has not yet reported any request or variation of these collective agreements by companies during this pandemic, during the pandemic as of now. So we don't know that it might happen again. It may happen in the next few months. The hotel and travel sector has been severely affected by the pandemic. And there is a recourse in the law if there is a serious changes in the situations. The parties can actually vary the collective agreement. So both parties can actually collectively bargain, and they need to go back to the industrial court to vary the collective agreement. And I would also like to highlight some of the challenges that the trade unions in Malaysia face, even to start off forming a trade union. It's very difficult for trade, it's very challenging for the trade unions to organize and claim recognition. The companies can drag out the trade unions on the issue of competence. They basically can say this particular trade union is not competent to represent the workers in this factory. And they can go to the High Court, they can go to the Court of Appeal, and then they can go to the Federal Court. So that means that there will be no recognition for that particular trade union, maybe in the next 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. So this is one of the ways in a way to stunt the growth of trade union in Malaysia. And the other thing that also the trade unions, the MTUC had actually also tried to register an association for domestic workers. They had attempted to do this in more than 2 occasions to register, and they used different strategies to register an association for domestic workers. There are more than 100,000 domestic workers in Malaysia who are not covered by any laws. And we also have undocumented workers who cannot join any trade union. These are the vulnerable groups. The first speaker has mentioned, and the second speaker has also said, the vulnerability of the migrant workers, women, and women in the domestic work. And so therefore, there are about at least more than 100,000 women in the domestic work who cannot join any particular association or to find any protection. And what also is very worrying is that at least there are more than 1 million undocumented workers who have no form of protection under any laws. So that is worrying. But and also the challenge that the trade unions face in organizing migrant workers. There's fear of dismissal, there's fear of the threat of arrest and deportation and all forms of harassment. And so these are some of the challenges the trade unions in Malaysia face in terms of organizing the migrant workers. If there is a union, it'll be, I'll just go on to the next point. But what the MTUC currently is also doing is basically providing for forms of legal assistance. And the trade unions in Malaysia have locals to represent workers in the labor court and the industrial court. And they continue to do this during this time of pandemic, where there are many complaints of unpaid wages from the migrant workers, and also that they are being forced to work in sectors which are not essential jobs. So now moving on. So it's time now for the trade unions also to consider it is, and the leverage is basically the bigger the number of workers in the trade union, it's easier for them to it makes it easier for them to bargain. So I stand corrected here. Maybe the other two panel speakers can say. What I understand is that maybe in moving forward, what can be done in countries like Malaysia, where there's restrictive laws in terms of right to association and collective bargaining. I understand the seafarers trade union. They have a structure where once you have an employment in that sector, you automatically become a member of the union. Maybe in moving forward, this is something that can be looked at in countries like Malaysia, where the laws are very restrictive. And of course, this discussion of the right to association has been going on maybe for the last 20 years. And this is all, the trade unions have been working on, negotiating, discussing, but still Malaysia has not ratified one of the conventions in terms of right to association. Moving on to my second point, another vulnerable group, the migrant workers. One of the questions which came up from there is whether Malaysia will resort, whether employers will resort to cheap foreign workers. And to that, I would like to say that yeah, so I just want to set out a little bit of background of migrant workers in Malaysia for those from other jurisdiction. Migrant workers are in 5 sectors: plantation, agriculture, construction, and domestic helpers. And they make up at least 15% to 30% of the labor force. And there are at least 1 million migrant workers, as I mentioned earlier, who are not in who have no legal status and have no protection under any laws. All laws apply equally to migrant workers, except domestic workers and undocumented workers. As Apollino had mentioned earlier, that in his presentation, that in January 2020, the Social Security Act was extended to documented migrant workers, emphasis documented migrant workers, for employment-related injury. The employment insurance scheme is not extended to migrants. And also, as he mentioned earlier, it was since Malaysia had ratified Convention 19, equality of treatment in places of accident. And yeah, as he had mentioned, so Malaysia had had a long discussion with the International Labour Organization, which had provided a lot of support to the Malaysian government to work out how they can actually implement the social security benefit to the migrant workers. It's still to be seen how it works because it's still very new. Migrant workers in Malaysia receive the minimum wage of 1,200 ringgit. And I just want to touch on a new development which has come into force in terms of the housing of migrant workers. And this is a good development in the sense that we know that there's been a lot of reports of overcrowding in housing, overcrowding, unhygienic situations in housing provided to migrant workers. Actually, the government had passed this regulation much earlier due to employer lobby. The implementation of this employees minimum standards of housing accommodations and amenities regulation came into force in September 2020, where if employers do not comply with the minimum standards provided in the regulations, there will be a penalty of a fine up to 50,000. And this is a good development in the sense of physical distancing. And the regulation provides that just a little bit details on what this regulations provide. You know, it provides for a single bed, a mattress, a locked cupboard. And what the importance of this is that the law clearly says that these 3 items cannot be shared. And this is really important in terms of the virus not being transmitted. We know in Malaysia, there are many housing areas provided to migrant workers where there could be 40 workers in a particular housing accommodation provided. And the first shift workers use the same mattress. And after that, they leave for their shift, and the second shift, the workers come into that housing and use the same mattresses. So, and this will definitely exacerbate it. I'm not saying that it is a potential health risk for workers. So this particular regulation will looks at providing better housing for physical, and provides at least space for physical distancing among the workers in this housing provided. And during the pandemic also, the government announced that 25% for employers or workers whose permits expire on 31st December, that there will be a reduction on levy. This reduction does not apply, of levy does not apply to domestic workers. And now, given that current policy, the government has announced that there will be a freeze on all new recruitments until 2020. The borders are closed. And the Ministry of Human Resources also has advised if a layoff is inevitable, foreign employees should be terminated first. The employment of the foreign employees should be terminated. Now, answering to the question, could COVID-19 trigger a change to hire cheap foreign workers? Now, there are two views to this. There are reports. There's a special report by Age Weekly which says that there are two views. Malaysians should be weaning off the dependence on cheap foreign labor. Paying workers low wages and housing them in congested quarters should not be tolerated further. And employers must adopt global best practices in labor management. And there's also recommendations saying that it's time to automate. It's time for automation. And with automation, you can do away with certain functions done by foreign workers or migrant workers. So that is some of the discussions which is taking place. But now for potential migrant workers who are now in the sending country and who wish to come to Malaysia or have already taken a loan to come to Malaysia, they will face difficulty because they may not get loans for recruitment fees. The recruitment and deployment will be delayed with border closing, and there will be delays due to quarantine and travel restrictions. And this may also cause irregular migration. And we understand also recruitment agencies are struggling and partially or fully ceasing operations. And so in the short term, automation might be also a challenge to SMEs. And I do understand that the HRDF, the Human Resource Development Fund, provides some funds for automation and also for upskill and reskilling workers. And so what will happen is, it is not that there will be a change to hire cheap labor, but basically it will exhibit the hire of undocumented workers, because this 1 million workers are still in Malaysia, and if and they may SMEs may hire this workers. Now I'm moving on to the social security adjustments. I think what I would like to, of course, the social security adjustments which has been announced by governments, it has been announced by governments, and so migrant workers in destination countries are excluded from COVID-19 stimulus packages and policy response, which including wage subsidies, unemployment benefits, and other social protection measures. So social protection should be extended and effectively enforced in sectors employing migrant workers, including domestic work and agriculture. I'd like to just very quickly, please bear with me, just go into this good best practice. I would like to say a best practice that we can look at, and maybe you have more examples of good best practices. And this was also mentioned by the keynote speaker on Monday on the social protection response to COVID-19 by the state of Kerala in South India. And there are many areas that we have talked, has been raised by the first speaker and the second speaker, of which this best practice may also look into responding. And what Kerala did basically in terms of COVID-19 response, reaping the benefits of investments in the public health system and following a human-centered approach. Kerala state has a population of 35 million people, and has followed a coordinated and effective COVID-19 response. The state government was among the first to introduce a precautionary statewide measures against the virus threats as early as January 2020, which they did building on its experience with epidemic outbreaks in the past by like Zika virus, yellow fever, and the Nipah virus. So that's also an opportunity for us to build on existing mechanisms. So with relatively high level of public health expenditure, 5.5% of total expenditure, the Kerala health system is ranked as the best in India and has recorded the second highest concentration of health workers. So going further to say, by strengthening its public health system, Kerala was able to better and more coherently respond to COVID-19 crisis than other states. It also followed, importantly, an all of government, all of society approach that included local governance bodies, community networks, and trade unions. In addition to the public health response, Kerala has also paid attention to the economic and social repercussions of the crisis, thereby ensuring good communications and the involvement of social partners and other relevant actors at all levels. We have also been we've been discussing about the cooperation of social partners and the role of social partners. And just to finish up on that best practice, soon after a lockdown was announced, the relief package was launched, including the distribution of food items to all households with a national ID and the provisions of basic services of those in need. These measures were complemented with income support, such as advance payments of old age widows or disability pensions, and transfers to self-employed and informal workers, as well as loans provided through women's cooperatives, and the provision of jobs through women's cooperatives, and the provisions of jobs through rural employment guarantee programs. Here we also see that we also spoke about women as also part as the vulnerable group in this pandemic. I just want to go to the second tool that can be used because
just check with you. Do you have a lot more material to cover?
No. Finally,
Okay.
the other points we can take it as part of recommendations.
Okay.
Okay, the last point. Am I already 14 to 15 minutes? So.
Oh, yeah, you've exceeded that.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, I just want to put forward a tool that has been developed by the ILO, which may be helpful because the SMEs has been saying the stimulus package that has been put forward by the government is quite bureaucratic. So the ILO has developed a tool which is known as the Rapid Social Protection Calculator for COVID-19. Based on a minimum set of parameters, users can cost several policy options, such as the extension of coverage of existing schemes to new beneficiaries, the increase of current benefit levels, and the introduction of universal or categorical lump sum benefits or temporary wage subsidies. Okay, I will stop at that. And maybe in terms of managing migration, it can come as a recommendation into shaping the new way of working. We can take it as part as a Q&A. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Annie. Sorry to have to.
No problems. I understand.
Okay. Okay. I'm glad, Hidayat, you're back on the video. Maybe I want to start off with the first question. So unemployment has probably hit record highs in most countries, if not all countries. And the law of supply and demand would put the advantage on the employers in setting maybe oppressive terms for labor. So how are the unions dealing with this? How are unions dealing with the fact that many people are desperate enough for work that they will accept any conditions, maybe even displacing current employees in a wide variety of sectors? Any of the panelists would like to tackle this? Hidayat, yeah.
Sure. I think I mean, we do have to come back to a couple of the points we made earlier, which is the issue of vulnerability. And I think it's important. Yes, there's increased unemployment, that creates fear and insecurity. And yes, people will take jobs out of desperation. But I think we need to understand that we can actually intervene in this through a couple of ways. As I said, we have to reassert some very fundamental collective rights. When it comes to the issue of social protection, just let me start with that. It should be clear that this isn't a policy recommendation, it's a constitutional obligation of governments. The very reason that the omnibus law in Indonesia is unconstitutional is because it violates the constitutional right to employment, to protection at work, to even the right to food. So I think it's important, this is only the third generation in most of our countries since independence from colonialism. All of the constitutions generally are about building up social protection of citizens and in society, in building new nation states. It's there in the constitution, very much neglected, and in fact, in the case of Indonesia now with the omnibus law, violated. I don't think we need to reinvent the policy of social protection. We have to actually implement it and ensure that all of the rules, regulations, policies, and guidelines conform to that, because it does coincide with the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and that timing in our history when these were recognized as universal human rights for a very clear political reason. And that was incorporated into many constitutions. So we do have to pursue that. And I think Annie spoke to some of those issues in terms of legal obligations and access to rights. So I think that, yes, unemployment will increase. Yes, people are under pressure. Yes, people are desperate. But if you have two things, the social protection, and there was a question about universal basic income, it is an obligation of states, of governments to provide the social protection needed. I think recommendation 202 outlines the social protection floor very clearly, that it needs to provide that protection to all people and to protect livelihoods. And then the right to freedom of association and your collective bargaining right is what you use to build on that social floor to improve livelihoods of yourself and your families through collective bargaining and through your union. I mean, people have to be able to access, it's about access to rights. It's not, and supply and demand, yes, I get the point, but supply and demand only exists through actual decisions of companies, of employers, of industries, and decisions of governments not to intervene. The market only exists because people don't intervene. And I think we need that intervention, and we need both the universal basic income and the social protection at this time, no doubt.
Right, thank you. Apolinar or maybe Hidayat, do you have maybe good inspiring stories of countries in this region that where unions have successfully pushed governments or pushed industries in this pandemic? Or are we seeing maybe a lack of any good role models in this region? Have unions in this region in maybe any of our countries? Do you have a good example in mind?
Yeah. If I go back to the protocols, right? We cannot, for us, we cannot just leave it to the government to issue the protocols for the workplaces, particular to an industry like the building and forest and woodworkers, for example. I mentioned earlier in the case of Philippines saying it's free, but actually if you look at the clause, it's not. Australia, of course, being an advanced country and relatively the union is strong, they managed to come up with, if you like, even a tripartite, very rare situation in the context of Australian trade union to come up with a protocol on construction industry, at least in Victoria State, that is discussed candidly by the social partners, and it's being implemented. The message here is we would like, of course, the economy's business activities to resume operations, but it should ensure that our workers, our members, should get job, but they should not get disease while working. And in a way that brings us to the earlier question you raised, that the issue of high employment. In Philippines, for example, there was like mixed statistics. Some are saying 27 million, some are saying 21 million, but that's the same. It's an army of unemployed, not to mention underemployed. And what we have to look at is like in the budget setting that's being debated by the House of Representatives, to make sure that there are provisions for the certain departments that are on the front line, like we said, Department of Health, trade and industry, that will generate a job. Construction is one of the flagship program for the economic recovery. So we have to make sure that there is budget, there is no corruption on the bidding process to start with, and there are provisions in the bid for safety, personal safety equipment and program to be put in place once the project starts. This is where we can ensure and then eventually organize these work sites. I hope that answers your question, Rajiv.
All right, thanks for your feedback. Annie or Hidayat, do you want to chip in anything?
Yeah, sure. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, I just want to add also that Malaysia has also got a very good mechanism in the sense that you have the National Labour Advisory Council. And this National Labour Advisory Council is chaired by the government of Malaysia and attended by employers and trade unions. And this is a mechanism that can be further leveraged to bring up all these issues that you have raised. And there's a lot of discussion, heated debates which goes on in this discussions, but it is a good mechanism that can be used to leverage at this time.
All right. Hidayat?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'd like to answer it, but maybe also answer a couple of questions that came up in the Q&A I'm looking at here.
Okay.
Yes, many positive examples, Rajiv. I mean, really, it'd be difficult to do this if we didn't have. I'm an elected official. My members are doing fantastic work in tackling with reducing the risk of occupational exposure to COVID-19 in the workplace, but also tackling these changes. And like our members in the Pakistan Food Workers Federation, for example, as I mentioned, our women leaders making such tremendous progress despite everything. We have a lot of unions that are still organizing new members, including young members in fast food and food delivery at this time, which is important progress. And we also have a lot of unions converting workers to permanent jobs who are in insecure positions. And that's always been our program, to convert casuals and temporary and contract workers to permanent positions, because it really changes your life and gives you that better job. But more than ever, having that secure job is a matter of life and death in many countries. And so that remains a critical priority. In terms of the questions, I think, these are really tough questions about technological change and the divide that it creates between workers, white collar, blue worker, the questions are about, and this vulnerability. I think the problem is that it's not really about skills and lower skilled or higher skilled. What I'm suggesting is that employers are now changing the very meaning of skills to be in a very different way. And I think to be highly skilled 10, 15 years from now will be a very different concept of what you might have today. And that has very serious implications for a number of things, including education policy. So I think that what they've done is, the workers that you may consider as having more technical skill are increasingly self-employed and working at home. And workers who are working in factories and workplaces like that are being de-skilled. They're facing a de-skilling, and that's a huge challenge, to lose those skills and the work to become more meaningless. We bring them together in response to Zaigen Tan's question. A positive example would be that we've had more technical workers join the union now than ever before. That we've got more workers who didn't believe they were workers before now joining our unions. They're coming together with blue collar workers and seeing this common challenge. A lot of quality control, lab staff joining our unions in different countries, and we see that as very positive. We also make progress with, I don't think anyone could be low skilled or unskilled anymore, because every government has declared food manufacturing and beverage workers as essential workers. And you have to utilize that. If the government has said the industry is so essential, you cannot stay home and keep safe, then surely it means that there is value in the work we're doing. It's skilled, recognized work. And we have to make that shift. And that's what a lot of our unions are doing, going back to bargaining, going back to negotiations and saying, hey, look, the government has said we're essential workers. That's why our members have to come to work every day under very difficult conditions to keep feeding this population in lockdown. We want the recognition for everyone. And we don't want that vulnerability, again, due to patriarchy, the gender discrimination, the racial discrimination that migrant workers face, but mainly the insecurity that plagues the industry. So I think that's really important in terms of negotiating change. We have to combine some of the best technologies that we need to make work safer and more effective with the quality of that work. And I think it came up again, we heard from that youth response yesterday, the quality of the jobs, the quality of the work, and the meaning of the work. And I think that is really the turning point now. And we use the discourse on essential work, vital work, frontline work to make that change. And that's what's really important right now.
I think it was quite interesting when you mentioned that the unionization is increasing, but that maybe may contrast with what Annie shared with us a bit earlier,
Yes.
that
Sure.
the union participation rate in Malaysia is incredibly low, less than 10%. Do you see that? Oh, from your perspective, how do you see things happening in Malaysia, or is Malaysia not following the trend of the region in increasing unionization of the labor force?
I guess it, Annie, you did speak about the fact that there's so many obstructions, and we do have an ILO complaint, by the way, over the difficulty in accessing the right to freedom of association. It's just so difficult. And, this is a human right, the right to join a union. It's in the Universal Declaration, the right to join a union. But what human right has 30, 60 days delay, administrative procedures, challenges, the employer can wait, 3 months to provide a list. If you can't access your human right now, that's justice denied, right? And so we really think those administrative obstacles have to be dealt with. But generally across the region, we do face a very common challenge, which is that increasingly a lot of the work is in the so-called informal sector or self-employed, like gig economy. That is a disguised employment relationship, because ultimately an employment relationship is about authority and power to determine your income and your livelihood and your well-being. That is not decided by Grab drivers. That's decided by a company. And so you're not self-employed. The gig economy, that technology allows a certain level of flexibility, et cetera, that people talk about, and you've talked about it this week. But ultimately, what you have is a series of disguised employment relationships where employer responsibility is unclear. Oh, sorry, Annie. Go ahead.
No.
Yeah.
So I was just agreeing to what you were saying.
Yeah. So I think that recognition, the moving, maybe if I could just say quickly, Rajiv, to respond to what Annie said earlier.
Finish.
Just to move people into the formal sector. Sorry, Dom, go ahead.
There are questions in the Q&A chat actually addressed to both of us. Maybe I can start there as well. Like this, whether this slow us down, this our collective action because of restriction, mass gathering, and so on. Certainly, it poses difficulties and challenges, but it didn't stop us. We have living examples in our affiliate in Sabah. At the height of the movement control order, the union managed to settle wages in the company, wood processing company, including that of migrant workers. We have outsourced workers in Holcim. Davao operation is a multinational company, obviously. They are staging their picket. They've been attacked at least twice in our record, but it didn't stop us, for example, for filing a complaint, OECD complaint, and it's ongoing. We have a very tenacious working condition of construction workers in Pakistan with a Chinese multinational company and international financing corporation funded hydrodram project, right? There was a forced lockdown, difficult to communicate to our members. Union officials are restricted to talk to them. They cannot access the work site. But again, because of the technology, that didn't stop us to file our complaint to IFC, the compliance advisory ombudsman of the World Bank, for example, is now looking at our complaint. It gives us challenges, but the technology and the availability of pursuing these cases actually don't stop at us at all.
Can I just add here, Rajiv, to your question, like, given that very limited space for the unions to register or to claim recognition in Malaysia, I just want to draw the attention to the electronics union sector. For a long time, the Malaysian government obstructed the formation of a trade union in the electronic sector, and there was at least about 150,000 workers in that particular sector, and mainly women. And after many years of going to court for a recognition, and negotiating with the government of Malaysia, it took them a lot of time, and I believe it is 2009 where the government for the very first time agreed to a regional union. So there is a regional union representing the northern region. That's a trade union representing workers in the northern region, the central region, and the southern region. So in that sense, as much as the laws have been very restrictive, the trade unions have been very persuasive in their putting forward the continuous engagement with the government. And finally, there is a good what shall I say? It resulted in a regional trade union being formed. So that's also something that is progressive, and something maybe that we can leverage on to see how, when we want to move forward, if whether the strategies that were used in negotiating with the government employers in terms of the electronic sector can be used to move forward.
Okay, come, let's deal with the 4 questions we have in the Q&A from the participants. Let's go in order. So Hidayat and Apolinar, has the collective action experience, getting people together, getting a seat at the table, being heard, successful negotiations, been easier or harder in recent years since the advent of technology and as jobs are increasingly going to self-employment modes enabled by technology platforms? We did touch a bit on that, but if you would like to give any more
Sure.
meat this question.
Okay.
You go ahead, if I can. First.
All right, Apolina.
Okay. Well, another example is you see in Philippines, it's the second time now that we are included in the I2C, the worst country because of trade union violations. Unfortunately, and in our record, at least 47 trade union leaders were killed, right, under the Duterte administration. And we've been knocking on the EU about this general system preference to at least suspend it because of the rampant violation of human and trade union rights. At least the two consecutive reports that I have seen, they are saying that generally still okay, the human rights and trade union rights condition of the country, as if it's a joke. They said it's still generally okay. So the GSP stands for Philippines. GSP, they have access to, some of the products of the country, Philippines, going almost a zero tariff, including Hidayat Union has a case in that GSP actually, in Tuna, in General Santos. Yeah, but right, there are restrictions, but we got a good resolution 2 weeks ago in the EU Parliament, calling on the government, and even now elevated to the Commission, saying you have to suspend it because of the rampant violation of workers and trade union rights. There were restrictions, but at the same time, there is still we still managed to get that small victory, if you like, in terms of advancing workers and trade union rights agenda.
Hidayat?
Yeah, sure. I think it's we have made progress. We continue to negotiate collective agreements. Our members have done extremely well. We've got our first national framework agreement covering all of the factories and distribution centers in Nestle Indonesia, for example. That took many, many years to get, but it was signed and finished during this pandemic. got our third collective in Malaysia, for example, the third collective agreement at the Fonterra site, which they did very well with at Fonterra, the dairy site, Barry Callebaut agreement, and so on. The FEIU in Malaysia has done an excellent job in that. Again, recognizing if the companies recognize that food workers are essential workers, it makes a big difference. We continue our campaigns, as Don also said. We've managed the campaigns. We've been very careful to ensure that we maintain all of the social distancing and everything we need to do. So we have maybe some more innovative campaigning, the Chupa Chups, for example, campaign in Bangladesh, where they've terminated our members in the middle of a pandemic. With Chupa Chups in Bangladesh, they're wearing the names of the terminated workers on their mask and doing other activities, so we don't have mass gatherings and so on. So we're very careful about the risks involved at this time. But what it speaks to, I think, is the resilience of unions. You have to build that resilience through the education and training that we've been working on, I believe, for many years. And this is a test of that. So where unions have not been resilient, they've been fragile, and they have not done well in this crisis. If they're resilient, if they've had the education and training, if they've organized women and youth, if they have more women in their leadership, that's what distinguishes them from other unions. If they've already been fighting for workers in insecure jobs, precarious jobs, and getting them permanent, if that's already been your agenda, then this is nothing new. So, you know, it really is a question now, plus unions that have, you know, we have a very good health and safety program in agricultural plantations. We just build on that, add COVID-19 and keep going. So I think it's really that question. I think it's in some ways good. It does two things, Rajiv. One is it shows the resilience of our unions. That's a test for us. If we're not doing well, that's our responsibility. We have to fix it, my personal responsibility as an elected official. The second is that really it shows that that you need a longer term perspective about this crisis. You need to adapt and change. You need to be organized in all the right places and build that collective strength. And I think, you know, it changes what workers may think a union does. There are some parts of our region where workers just think the union is a bunch of people who are going to get your collective agreement and your wage increase every year. That has changed. The union is now keeping you and your family safe. The union is guaranteeing a safe workplace, even in tough economic times. And I think that is the kind of unions we want.
All right, let's jump to the second question. So labor replacement will be coming to developing nations, which often rely on labor-intensive industries. So how are these blue-collar and white-collar workers, the white-collar workers bringing in the automation, the labor replacement automation? How do you see them organizing together? How have the unions been working towards this agenda, Hidayat, yeah, you go first.
Yeah, just, I mean, I mentioned it earlier when I was addressing that question. So I think that the distinction between white and blue collar is not as it ever was. I mean, that's industrial revolution distinction. We've moved on from that. And basically, you know, there isn't such a clear line. Our so-called blue collar workers are highly skilled. You know, there's a lot of digitization already in a lot of our factories. And a lot of the work is actually inputting data. There's a lot of data input that people are doing, a lot of self-management, self-monitoring. That's not white-collar work. It's all the same. And a lot of the so-called white-collar work has become just data input as well. And so what we do see is a de-skilling taking place, which is a challenge. But I think it's brought people together. And the question is, how much of the technological change is necessary in terms of making it safer, better, more meaningful work and producing, say, better quality and safer products? And how much of it is just cost saving? And I think at the moment, unfortunately, the balance is in favor of just saving money, and that's not sustainable. You know, and so, but that also brings people together because, you know, yeah, they're now devaluing the labor. It doesn't matter how much work you've done and how much training you've done, how much reskilling there is. If you don't establish a link between the reskilling, the skill level as in terms of real skills, and the value of that work, then you're never going to make progress. And so it's important both through government intervention and the right to freedom of association, which then becomes our responsibility in terms of bargaining, to reestablish the link. That wages productivity link was already broken by financialization. They're now breaking any link between so-called skill level and the value of work. And we have to reestablish that. Otherwise, all of the retraining in the world won't produce decent jobs.
But do we risk then this automation picking up a faster speed if
I don't
That's
think
the thing.
so. I think there's a limit, there's a limit. They're
Mm.
fascinated with it now. And I go to these meetings and the company people are extremely excited. But as with everything, you need people, you need intuition, you need human creativity. At the end of the day, you need people on decent wages to consume all these products they're trying to make. So the economics of it doesn't make sense. We're facing a global recession, and the only way for ASEAN countries to get out of a global recession is not open up to FDI, as the Indonesian government thinks they're trying to do. Nothing's coming. It's a global economic crisis. We're in the lowest level of global production since 1930. This will be an economic crisis 5 times worse than 2008. Where do they think the money is going to come from? The only way to recover from this economic crisis is decent wages, social protection, income support, and we will spend domestically out of this crisis. Domestic spending will drive every country out of this crisis, not foreign investment. It's simply not going to work. So if you combine, as the omnibus law does, foreign investment, cheaper wages, for young people, that is not job creation. That means doing 3 jobs to get by.
Mm.
That makes no sense at all.
Annie, is there something you want to weigh in?
I just want to say, in terms of whether labor replacement in terms of automation, when you look at Malaysians' labor scenario, 80 to 90% are small and medium enterprises. So
Yes.
how will the small and medium enterprises leverage on automation? And that is why for a long time, as much as there's been a lot of discussion and there's incentives provided by the government through the Human Resources Development Fund to automate, but the SMEs have not leveraged on it. So this will be a challenge for small and medium enterprises. They are still dependent on manpower.
All right. So in the last year's budget, the Malaysian government rolled out a whole slew of incentives
This,
to help with grant matchings and outright grants, as well as matching grants for companies to automate, to increase the automation and reduce the reliance of foreign workers. Do you see this having a tangible impact on workers, migrant workers, local workers?
Actually, this has, as much as the government might have mentioned it officially recently, but this has been done in the previous years. The government has been persuading the small and medium enterprises, and we did a training. At the time I was with the ILO, we did a training for the employers. And that was at least actually more specific to management of migrant workers in the northern and southern and the central region. We did the training, and there was still no take so much on automation. It was more still reliance on foreign labor.
Okay. All right. Let's move to the next question. We have from Eileen Sin. The theme which cuts across the presentations is the vulnerability of low-skill manual workers. I was wondering what is the policy response or institutional practices, if there have been any, towards higher skill migrant workers. To what extent has the vulnerability of the more advantaged been sidelined? Would anyone like to tackle this question?
I think there's a misconception of the blue collar, white collar, low skilled and high skilled when it comes to being infected by COVID-19 in this context of the discussion. We have nurses and doctors who are working overseas, and they are also exposed and they have contracted the disease. I think the better framing of the discussion here, or the narrative, is the accessibility of social security and programs and services for migrant workers, regardless of your low skilled, high skilled, or even we can go to the extent that even regardless of the status. I think that's a better way of articulating it further. And if I can just go back also to the blue collar, white collar, also developed countries and supplied by local blue collar developing countries. even in the national context, it's a little bit dangerous. We have experience, for example, of in the course of establishing unions. This is in Sabah. They will say, okay, this is a managerial position, but actually, or this is a assistant manager or assistant supervisor. But if you look at what they are actually doing, they are actually still doing the rank and file blue collar work, but the intention of the management is obviously to remove them from the scope of the membership, right? I think that is also prevalent in some service sector, even in commercial sector, even in banks. No, you have a title of a manager, but actually what you're doing, you don't have the prerogative of the manager of hiring and firing people, for example, but it's an obvious maneuvering just to take you away from the rank and file so you cannot join the union. We have to be watchful of that.
Okay. Maybe we can move to the next one. Annie, in the context of Malaysia, how good is the relationship between the Ministry of Human Resources, trade unions, and the Malaysian Employers Federation?
Okay. Just let me take that down. Okay, how's the relationship? Yeah, I think I'll just go back to saying that the National Labour Advisory Council, this is where the three parties meet together. This it's a good mechanism which is in place, but what happens is it is up to the Ministry of Human Resources to call for meetings. And for the last 10 years, the F actually worked on modernizing labor laws. And until today, we know that the labor laws are still the review, the repeal of this review of the Trade Union Act, the Industrial Relations Act, has still not, Employment Act has still not come to Parliament yet. So though the discussions are taking place at the National Labour Advisory Council, but after the discussions take place, and they have actually technical groups within the National Labour Advisory Council looking at the specific laws, and these recommendations are drawn and actually brought to the they have these discussions, but nobody knows at the end of the day, it's all that nothing moves forward. It either gets stuck in the Ministry of Human Resources, or does it go to the AG's chambers and who vets those changes to the laws? And so this has been dragging on for a long time. In terms of relationship, I would say in certain areas, of course, when it comes to trade union recognition, then there is really not so much of cooperation between the employers or the trade union. But as I just mentioned, that the training that we had done, where 240 employers had attended these meetings, and we had a panel from the government, the trade union, civil society, Ministry of Home Affairs as well. Actually, sometimes I think the divide between public and public is more than public and private. In terms of, especially in terms of governance of migrant labor, which currently is done by the Ministry of Home Affairs, and the Ministry of Human Resources actually is the one who actually looks at the manpower. And there's so much of a discussion which came up in those meetings, where we could see the difference of understanding, where in the northern parts of the state, they had agreed with the trade unions. They were most actually restrictive in their understanding of the right to association. But as it came to KL, where there's more discussion, more creation, more dialogue between the social partners, there was better understanding and say, yes, we are okay with the right to association, but they need to follow the laws. And what does that mean? The laws are actually restrictive. And so basically you can see that. So there are some areas where there's good cooperation between the social partners, but it depends, it all depends on the area and the issues that we are discussing. In terms of labor laws, it is still been, in terms of cooperation between, there's good cooperation, they sit down, they discuss, they look at the stakeholders, but then nothing is finalized after those meetings.
Okay.
And Malaysian Employers Federation also has, has raised a lot of concerns that, the ministry announces policies and they read it in the newspaper, and then they find out about this implementation of policies in the newspaper. So they also have a difficulty in moving along in terms of law reforms, or what are the policies that the government is implementing, because it's suddenly announced and everybody is off guard. So there's some cases where they work, there are so many meetings where the social partners meet together, but then at the end of the day, whether those things are implemented.
Okay.
If Rajiv, if I can, on this
Yeah, all right.
topic on
Jump in.
NLSC in Malaysia, if the debate on the labor law reform in Malaysia is an indicator, particularly the Industrial Relations Act at the height of it, I would say that NLAC is a farce. It's a comedy.
That's true.
I mean, there's no seriousness even from the unions. They even oust or refuse to let Andrew Law to participate in one of the meetings because he has a different position from the MTUC representatives. I mean, if the question here is what will it take for NLC to be truly effective and alternative tripartite body, I think it should start for MTUC to put its house in order.
Well, there's a new committee now. We may see some new progress coming through the new committee, which has just been elected recently.
Okay. Annie, maybe continuing on this, you mentioned the next question. You mentioned the National Labour Action Council as an important forum, but we keep hearing complaints about unions about the council's passivity and the lack of authority. Do you want to talk about this?
I think Dong has just answered that.
Yeah.
Because basically, I would say it's definitely a good forum, and this forum is where the social partners who meet. But as I said also, in terms of talking about modernizing labor, they call it modernizing labor laws, and that's a term that they use. So I'm just repeating the term used by the government in terms of looking at those laws. But after a lot of discussions, and then nothing comes true. So as Dong said, is it effective? And also those meetings are only called at the purview of the minister. If the minister calls it twice or 3 times or 4 times, so it doesn't call at all for the whole year. So you sit and wait. So the employers wait, the trade unions wait, and so but then there's no meeting. But and also the
So the
NLCs.
employers and the trade unions don't meet other than when the minister calls for the meeting?
Sorry, again?
The MEF and the unions, do they meet on their own, or do they only wait for the minister to call for this council meeting?
The NLAC is a tripartite meeting, but in terms of when ILO organizes meetings, then you have all 3 social partners attending and providing their views. And I believe there's a lot of good discussions, good inputs, good insights which comes along. And it's just that when it becomes like to right to association and collective bargaining, where it becomes very sensitive, then the employers take a different position. And then also it's very slow in terms, Hidayat also mentioned that, how long the recognition process waits in a particular industrial relations department before it goes to the trade union department, and so forth.
All right. Okay, let's move to the next question. Hidayat, this question is from an anonymous attendee. If it's necessary to bring technology to the workplace, what steps unions should take to make sure it is not replacement of worker, but to increase their capability? Like in the beginning, you mentioned about the company, they just want the direct workers to put smart devices in place, but not training them to work to resolve any problem. All right, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a very good question. And I think that the first is that in the report, and it was shared with you, the United Workers Union in Australia has this report I mentioned that Lauren Kelly put together about technology and power. In that report, there's what they call an ethical framework for workplace technology. And in the ethical framework, there are just 14 questions this is critical. These are 14 questions a union should ask in response to any new technology. The purpose, the use of data, the privacy, the security around the issues, and so on. And then you're basically using the ethical framework for workplace technology to negotiate the change. And I think that's really important. And what we've had in some places, and part of this is not new. So, for example, we have several unions at factory level in the Philippines and other countries that have negotiated what happens with CCTV footage, right? That's surveillance. Now, we need it for security, yes, but increasingly CCTV cameras are everywhere used to monitor workers and is misused in all sorts of disciplinary proceedings. So some of them have reached an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, saying, okay, this is for everyone's safety, security, it's for the safety of the product. The cameras should be at the product, not aimed at the workers. It can't be misused by the security management team, especially footage of women workers, which is often misused in many of these big companies. And that is sexual harassment that won't be tolerated. So, basically, ethical is a good word, ethical standards on the use of this. At the same time, you're also pushing, is it necessary? So we're not saying no to new technology, but how does this make our jobs safer, better, and more meaningful? And a lot of this technology simply doesn't. It's cheap, it's quick, it's easy, it's prepackaged, it comes with a brand name, you bang it in, and then you hope people just cope with it. And it's creating, in the middle of a pandemic, actually a lot more problems if you're trying to fast track it. And the final point is, and union members are aware of this, a key approach is everything's a pilot, right? If you're going to introduce something, it must be isolated, affecting only one area, tested, then reviewed with the union and the workers involved, and you test it. Too often in all of our countries, especially multinational companies, introduce a pilot and it just goes on for years. It's called a pilot, but there's no end, there's no review, there's no feedback. So a pilot's a pilot. 3 months, you come back together, what's the impact, is it working? And a pilot means you can stop it. We don't need it or it's detrimental. So I think you just take that position, but I do think the ethical framework for workplace technologies is a great start. And we're using in Pakistan, for example, our team and our women unions Empower team is using it to set up what they're going to call their technological rights, a charter of rights for workers about new technology.
Okay. I think in the chat, there's also a question. Let me pull it up. So on unions negotiating data, so do you have any comment on how advanced are unions taking up the issue of negotiating workers' data rights?
Yeah, well, I think that answered partly earlier.
Yes.
Again, the ethical framework for workplace technology deals with that, about the use of the data and privacy. Mm-hmm.
Maybe we need to talk about how advanced that, are all unions on top of this?
No, not at all. Not at all. A lot of it's just seen as unilateral policy. Management feels they have management prerogative. You don't need to talk to the union about it. A lot of hotels, for example, have new technology like that. And so it requires a lot of awareness about what workers' rights are when it comes to data. And our team's done a lot of, I believe, very good work. We have 24 people in the Asia Pacific region. And part of what we do is be able to repackage it, have all the questions you should ask. Everything's approached as a question because you're going to negotiate the change about what the data is used for and so on, and reach agreements about its use or reach a point where you don't provide it. We're still in an educational process about that. So I'd say that advanced, no, but are we getting there? I think so, yes. And people are more and more aware of it now. Ironically, because of this situation with the COVID-19 and the use of all sorts of technology, one of the responses we're getting is people feel that their working day doesn't begin and end. So our members who are doing work from home to keep them safe, it just doesn't end. And so, the invasion of their personal time, their family time is a huge problem. And that's got a good discussion going about privacy, surveillance, and drawing that line between workplace and private and family. And that we use that discussion to say, well, you know what, even when you're back at work, there's a privacy issue. So I think we can continue to make good progress on it. The key is for workers to understand it can be negotiated. You don't know that if you don't have a union. So in a non-unionized workplace, it's going to be impossible to respond to this. You just accept it like you accept everything else. And I think that's why the right to freedom of association is so fundamental in reshaping this technological change.
All right.
It's
Maybe
a
we're
good
gonna,
segue to the still open question in the Q&A.
yeah, we're gonna go to the last question soon. But do you want to give a comment, or shall we jump into the last
Yeah,
question?
I can take that one also to maybe
Okay,
just to
you
start
give
off.
your comment and take on the last question. Must the worker union rely on a third party, be it the government or an international body, to initiate a conversation with the employers? I want to say no, but maybe Apolinar, you would like to kick the
Yeah,
conversation on this, kickstart the conversation on this.
the current illustration or example here is those who are forcibly repatriated from countries of destination. At the height of the COVID-19 outbreak, suddenly companies have closed down, slowed down, and they have to either renegotiate their contract, terminate their contract, change their working conditions. In UAE, there's even a decree, I think it's Decree 275, that allows employer and employee to renegotiate the contract, to change it because of the slowdown. And without union representation in these countries, in Gulf regions, you can imagine that they will say yes because of force. They already highly debted back home. Some of them just even started their work just a month. And then suddenly they will say, you accept this or not, or you go back home. Well, what can you do? I mean, if there's no union or a workers representative that can say, you have a legal obligation, there's a contractual agreement on this regard, or you change your recruitment agent because they're part of that scheme after all, right?
Okay. Annie, do you want to add something?
No, I think I'm good. I think Dong has answered it. Yeah.
Okay, good. So let's go on a final round before we wrap up this session. Maybe 4 to 5 minutes each person. If you'd like to give any final words on our discussion today. I think we have a couple of elected representatives in this session. If you'd like to give any policy recommendation to the politicians, if you'd like to give any recommendations to the fellow colleagues out there, who would like to go first? Hidayat?
Sure, thanks, Rajiv. Well, I think that it for us, it still comes back to the need to address the vulnerability that's related to precarious employment. All of the kinds of informal employment, so-called self-employment, disguised employment relationships, and contract casual work. I think we really need to tackle this. It's a combination of both getting better secure jobs in workplaces and also the government social protection that is obliged. That's an obligation and a right of the government and the right of citizens. We really need to restore that. We need to push back against, I think, moves like the omnibus law in Indonesia that needs to be repealed. It's unconstitutional. It will not create jobs. It will create precarious jobs on very low wages for a very short period of time. It's no solution at all. We also need to make sure that some of the policy and stimulus package that are being talked about are long-term. This vulnerability, this fragility of the system existed before the COVID-19 pandemic and crisis. The crisis just exposed it. So we need to make sure that these aren't just temporary measures to bail out small and medium enterprise and to prevent bankruptcies and to create a few jobs and to provide training. This is no temporary matter at all. It has to be a long-term commitment to provide this protection for all workers and especially protection for migrant workers. And that comes back to the issue of status recognition of undocumented workers. There's an entire informal economy that needs recognition in order to access their right to social protection. We need to push that. And I think we are making progress in some places. And as Annie spoke about, it's occurring at state level, at subnational level in some countries, but we really need to push that at a national level. And finally, I think to just address a question that came up in the chat, what we don't need now is the kind of free trade deals, free trade regimes that prevent governments in the region from doing what they have to do. It's very clear governments must now reallocate resources, invest in healthcare, invest in education, invest in housing. They've got to protect all of these fundamental rights. Plus, we're facing this global food crisis from next year, the right to food. So on World Food Day, our priority, the right to food and nutrition, is so essential. The RCEP, for example, like every other free trade deal, even though it's regional, ASEAN, China, and so on, the RCEP still threatens to force open agricultural markets, undermine food security, ultimately just prevent governments from doing what they say they need to do, which is to secure and guarantee these rights. So this is no time, and it's never been a time, but certainly we've had 45 years of neoliberal free trade deals that have shifted resources to the private sector, that have focused on profit, and it's failed us. The one thing we learned from this pandemic and crisis is it failed. And we don't go back and rebuild it. We build something new, something different. This is no time to get back to the normal business of the RCEP to get it back on track. It is no benefit at all. And my final point, to reiterate, the domestic spending, rebuilding through that with government spending and support is critical to our economic resilience right now. There's no way that we could, and it's not 2008. China doesn't have the money for it. They're in crisis. This is the worst economic crisis since the Depression. And we have 2 or 3 years more of it. We probably have another year of the pandemic if things don't go well. So on top of all the healthcare that's needed, and to ensure, I should say, as we've all said, a vaccine is accessible to all. If the vaccine is not accessible to all, once a viable vaccine becomes available at the end of next year, this pandemic will go on for another 5 years. So it's a huge crisis. Can I add one more thing, Rajiv? And I'm sorry it's off track. I'll abuse the time.
Okay.
There's a very important report that we work on, and this is World Food Day, so I'll mention it. The United Nations Environmental Program brought out a very important report called Preventing the Next Pandemic. They identify 7 human-mediated actions, 7 things about what people do that are encouraging the emergence and spread of diseases like the SARS-CoV-2, the new coronavirus that causes COVID-19. And those 7, what they call disease drivers, include industrialized agriculture, urbanization, destruction of the environment, climate change, the demand for meat protein. They've identified this COVID-19 is the result of the way we eat and live. We created this through human action. So what they're saying is preventing the next pandemic, and we should pay attention to that. If we don't address the environmental destruction, the way our food system operates, if we don't deal with climate change and industrial agriculture, we're looking at the next pandemic. And I think that's what no one wants right now, and we should educate people about that. There are 1,000 new zoonotic diseases that could be comparable to this, 1,000, and that will continue as long as we're destroying the environment and not responding effectively to climate change. Thank you, Rajiv.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Apolina?
Thank you. In terms of operational policy guidelines, it's very important for Building and Woodworkers International, the strengthening of labor inspection system. And we will always hear the arguments of government saying we don't have enough number of safety inspectors to do the job and everything. But we have read the answer for that. We have trade unions. There must be safety officers, safety trade union that we can even train. And this is a in-house built-in mechanism that is always there every day. Some are even 24 hours. That is already the watchdog, if you like, of making it sure that they comply with the new protocols, guidelines in particular workplaces that needs to be in business, but it's safe and it's providing a decent job for workers and union members. Second, takeaway points, we should work together to stop weaponizing migrant labor. The global labor market is facilitating social tensions that is eroding also the social gains of unions particularly. I'm wondering, is it a coincidence that every time there's an election in Sabah, they deport Indonesian and Filipinos and find a good excuse that these migrant workers are actually the one spreading the virus? I mean, it's a good question for the audience to think of also. But the point is, free movement has been equated to stealing of jobs, which in turn spawn racism and xenophobia. The ripple effect of a low-wage business model has invented the politics at the same time that push millions into continuing poverty. So this must be stopped in our new normal way of thinking. Stop weaponizing migrant labor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Annie.
Yeah, okay. I think I just have 2 points to close. And one will be definitely decent employment opportunities need to build on existing normative frameworks and be guided by the international standards, especially the labor laws in Malaysia, which needs urgent review and repeal, and to comprehensively address the pandemic. So this is really urgent. It's an urgent need. And the second one, that in the spirit of the ASEAN labor ministers joint statement, where they say they will act jointly and decisively to control the spread of the disease while mitigating in adverse impacts, safeguarding the people's well-being and maintaining social economic stability. I would like to just say that on the one initiative that can be under that joint statement is that there should be an inclusive and responsive labor migration policy for future preparedness in ASEAN. And there should be guidelines for labor migration management, where there should be continuous efforts to work towards zero recruitment fee, improving housing and wages, and to ensure physical distancing for the migrant workers, extending migrant workers with social protection, stop the arrest and detention of migrant workers, so that they can come forward to do their testing and they have access to healthcare and testing and treatment, and also for the emergency and pandemic preparedness planning. So this should come under the inclusive and responsive labor migration policy for ASEAN. And this is also very important that it's to be done because, like, you know, in countries like Malaysia, you have 30% of the population is migrant labor. So this is very important that to be addressed. With that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you very much, Annie, and thank you very much, Apollina and Hidayat, for all your insights. And I hope all the audience that were tuning in, you've gained from this session. I think I'm passing the floor back to Ivy or Farhana.
Thank you very much, Rajiv.
All right,
Thank you.
Ivy, take it from here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the great sessions. I thought that was very, very insightful, very enlightening. And the emphasis on the labor response has certainly dovetailed very well with the conversations that we've been having for the last 4 days. So this kind of concludes our regional conference that has been going on for 1 week. And I now have the very unenviable task of trying to wrap up the whole conference. This will certainly be a very tall order, so I hope you can forgive me if I'm not doing a good job. So let me just share the slide with you. Just bear with me for a moment. All right. So I think overall we have had a very fruitful 1 week. We have very well-rounded discussions, and the insights that we have been getting are very representative across the region. And the conference actually structured in such a way where we can hear the points of views of different stakeholders. We started day 1 with a big picture, and then we had day 2 was the company perspective, i.e. the employers. Today we had the labor response, i.e. the employees. And on day 3 and day 4, we also had a spotlight on the youth as well as the gig worker. So throughout the last 1 week, we also have a group of artists that have been tirelessly drawing some doodles as the conference was going on. And I think that it will only be it will only do them justice if I share them with you. So this was the first day. Our opening session was a big picture. We had with us Prof. Jayati Ghosh from India, Professor Jomo from Malaysia, as well as Dr. Nansari also from Malaysia. Our speakers have highlighted to us how COVID-19 have exposed our fragile resilience to catastrophic shocks, And this includes the shocks to our health systems, social protections, as well as our economic models. The pandemic has also exposed and exacerbated the inequality in our societies. The wealth and seen the income remain unchanged or even increased, while the vulnerable groups are even more distressed. This has led to the possibility of what Prof. Jayati has termed a K-shaped recovery, where the inequality would actually became worse. There are also a lot of developing countries that are not being given adequate response to the COVID-19 crisis. And to the large extent, the COVID-19 has highlighted the failures of what Prof. Jomo termed as the neoliberal counter-revolutions of the past 40 years. And this counter-revolution was against Keynesians, and also the role of state as the economic driver. The Washington consensus, unfortunately, has been internalized, and the belief that state could only do harm. In a way, the silver lining of this pandemic is to review the fact that this is not true, and there is actually a need for fiscal expansion. In dealing with the crisis, developed countries have that are normally quite conservative is now even spending up to 20% of their GDP. This need is even greater in the developing countries, but unfortunately, we have not been seeing a very bold fiscal response due to the reluctance to borrow and spend, and the belief that we need to stick to our debt ceiling. So we need to realize that the economic disruption caused by the COVID-19 is largely triggered by lockdowns and physical distancing, and this has caused a lot of loss on income. So in that regard, government need to step in to spend in order to boost stimulate the aggregate demand and growth. One of the policies that should be taken more seriously in the future is the universal basic income. And our speaker also remind us that it is time to think about our paths and not to repeat the mistake of the past, because we make the new normal and we cannot depend on external forces or the free market forces. Some of the areas that our speakers have said that we should focus on includes a regain of control of food supplies, or rather the strengthening of the food security in every country, because many countries are actually not producing enough food for themselves. We need to actually enact a domestic Green New Deal. Care economy needs to be emphasized. And with the disruptions to global supply chain, there must be some kind of reshoring within reasons. We also need better risk management and take advantage of the tsunami of the technological development to raise human condition and prepare our future workforce better. So this leads us to the second day, where we zoom in on the company perspective. The moderator started by stating that we need a paradigm shift towards a more resilient approach. We also have with us Dato' Shamsuddin from Malaysia, Dr. Pavida from Thailand, as well as Mr. Yoon from South Korea. So our speakers agreed that the uncertain period will last until at least end of 2021. And the situation is very dire for a large percentage of the firms. In the case of Malaysia, the government interventions focuses on lives and livelihood, and this has been generally helpful so far for both employers and employees, and it should be continued. COVID-19 has a lot of broad-based negative impacts and also disrupted the global supply chain. Some of the challenges that are faced by the companies are actually on a continuum. They are mostly pre-existing, but accelerated because of the pandemic. Because of the pandemic, companies need to be flexible, adaptable, and agile more so than ever. And so the speakers also say that the transition to a new normal is inevitable. And the key is that we ensure we don't return to the old ways. All the stakeholders must be involved in the design for the new normal, especially for the workers. Government support packages so far have enabled businesses to withstand the effect of the crisis. However, this did not prevent companies' cash buffers from depleting, and a lot of employees has been asked to take pay cuts, unpaid leave, or unpaid leave. Sorry. Nearly half of the firms expect that they will need more than 6 months to recover the lost ground. This is according to the Malaysian Employer Survey. Of course, we also see some sectors experiencing rapid growth, and this is especially true for the gig platforms and online shopping. Gig economy in Malaysia has grew from 500,000 workers to 2.8 million. Export-driven companies have also changed their focus from US and Europe to Asia. Regional trade actually grew by 4 times compared to 2.8 times for the rest of the world. There is also a shift from trade in goods to trade in services, with the trade in services grew 60% faster than the trade in goods. Some of the strategy adopted by the company includes accelerating the process of automation, and this will of course diminish the appeal to labor cost arbitrage. Digitalization also received a huge boost from the pandemic, and many SMEs also created firms that are e-commerce businesses. A lot of multinational corporations are diversifying their locations due to the increased political risk. And one of the most prevailing one is the so-called China Plus One model. So in a nutshell, from this day, we conclude that we need to ensure that no one is left behind in the transition to a more efficient and sustainable model. We need to build a new normal by including all stakeholders, especially by including the workers. Special attention needs to be given to the small and medium enterprises and to ensure that not only big companies will survive this pandemic. There needs to be a clear transition plan beyond the short-term support, as the jobs that we lost in the crisis will continue to be lost to automation. Finally, there needs to be a better social protection model especially for the gig workers. So on day 3, we highlighted the issues faced by the gig economy. We had Mr. Noor Hisham from Malaysia, Mr. Fahmi from Indonesia, and Mr. Jaigan from Malaysia as well. So for this session, we have discussed how our world has become more complex and volatile. There is a gradual shift towards temporary employment and contract work as larger companies manage their risks. The skills that we have are also fast becoming obsolete, and in the future, the kind of skills we need might change, and we need to be even more flexible than usual. Automation also leads to hollowing out of middle income jobs, and there is less need now for manufacturing or office jobs. In Malaysia, we have seen a very steady drop in the regular salary workers from 5.3 million to 4.7 million today. Mr. Fahmi also provided us a snapshot of what is happening in Indonesia. where the rapid growth of motorbike, taxi or Jab, and also the boom of smartphone has actually led to an emergence and popularity of the app-based transportation. This does not come with controversies. There's a lot of legal discontents in this regard, which warrant the questions of whether app-based drivers are micro-entrepreneurs or they are simply precarious 4.0. This is because drivers have very little bargaining powers. The tariff decided by the company, or rather the algorithm, and the workers also lack contracts, and therefore there's no legal protection for them. So to overcome these challenges, there are a few recommendations that have been put forward by our speakers. One of it is how to redesign our welfare arrangement so that the protections are tied to the workers instead of the employers. This will make the benefits more portable. And in Malaysia, the government actually provided a 50 million matching grant to incentivize the companies to contribute for their workers. Secondly, we also need to have a skill training funds directed to workers. This is especially crucial as when in the context of gig workers, the responsibility of reskilling and upskilling falls on the employee and not the employer. So the government will need to step in to direct the funds for them to reskill and upskill. One good example is a Skills Future in Singapore that direct $200 Sing dollar to each citizens for training programs. Third is regarding the labor union. The labor union will need to transform itself as well. It needs to allow access for gig workers and to help them to have access to the industrial courts in the event of disputes. There's also a need for some standard setting at the international level on the treatment towards the gig workers. This session is also quite special because we also have the chance to hear directly from two frontliners. One of them is Mr. Arif, who is the president of the Grab Drivers Association in Malaysia. Mr. Arif was sharing with us the challenges faced by the drivers in Malaysia and how many of them have actually experienced a great loss of income when the lockdown started. And they also have to adapt by, instead of carrying passengers, they have to now do more delivery work. The second person is Dr. Rubini, who is a medical doctor at Tawau, Sabah, one of the most affected area by the pandemic. So she also shared with us how her regular day as a doctor have changed since the COVID-19 happened. And this includes the difficulties that doctors face in terms of helping patients, building trust because of the need to wear more protection layers, how access to healthcare has reduced for those that are non-COVID cases or not in the critical stage. That say the state has been supporting the crisis by providing some help to the medical personnel. So on day 4, we talked about the youth perspective, and I think my colleague Farhana has done a very good job in summarizing that earlier today. So I will keep this short. I think essentially the three speakers who are Dr. Lee from Malaysia, and also Bima from Indonesia and Ms. Pam from Vietnam has shared the challenges faced by the youth in these three countries. And there are a lot of common challenges that are faced by the youth. So one of it would be the supply-demand mismatch. And we also talk about the issues of the low wages, as well as the involvement of youth in self-employment as well as gig economy. One of the things that was highlighted was how there is when when you from a better-to-do families would obviously have better opportunities, whereas youth from a more vulnerable groups really struggle. One of the things that came from these sessions that I really like is the mention about the new mindset on the concept of work, which I think that our session today also talked about. Fundamentally, we need to rethink what is the concept of work, what is the role of jobs, how we can have a dignified jobs, what is a decent work, and how do we make sure that workers have a proper work-life balance in this new normal. So with that, I will bring us to our session today. Sorry for this session, the doodle is not ready yet. But I think that we also discussed a lot about the labor response. Specifically, I think Mr. Hidayat have gave us a very good overview about the plight of the workers in the food and hospitality industries. And he pointed out that the workers in these industries as one of the most undervalued occupation. There is a disconnect between the contribution of their work to the society and the wages that they receive. Women and foreigners are particularly vulnerable in the food sector due to the discrimination, and the technology transformation does not necessarily lead to change and good well-being in their lives. While automation picks up, there's also a differentiation between technical skills and soft skills, with the latter being more sought after. However, the challenge is that a lot of the attitudes are judged in a very subjective way. And this is particularly challenging when there's already an inbuilt bias in the particular country or the community, such as patriarchy or racism. And he also pointed out that how in the case of Pakistan, it has been shown that some of the monitoring tools actually cause more stress among the workers. So he has concluded by saying that in technology intersects with power, and we need to reaffirm the rights to work as a universal human rights as enshrined in the Declaration for Human Rights. We need to steer technology based on the social goals that we want to achieve and not the other way around. And it is important for us to ensure that the future of work is the future of dignity. So second speaker, Mr. Apollina, introduced us to the BWI Declaration. So I don't actually remember what BWI stands for. Workers International, right?
Building and Woodworkers International, no worries.
That's right, thank you so much. So that addresses the rights of the workers that are left vulnerable by the crisis and suggested for the trade unions to be more active. He has also showed us the failure. He also said the pandemic has showed that the failure of the current economic architecture, and citing the example of Philippines where a lot of the nurses and doctors migrated to other countries and therefore straining the Philippines' capacity to deal with crises like COVID-19. He mentioned the point that has been actually repeated by many of the speakers in the past 4 days, which is that we need a stronger social security system. We need it to be more robust and to allow for affordable healthcare for workers, and especially important for the workers when they are unemployed. So lastly, he also mentioned that there needs to be improved protection for migrant workers, which is a group of workers that are always left behind. Ms. Annie talked about the Malaysian labor law and how it has curtailed the right to association of the trade union. In Malaysia, only less than 10% of the workers are unionized. And this is because there's very significant challenges that trade unions face in Malaysia. There has been attempts to register the Association for Domestic Workers by the Malaysian Trade Union Congress, but unfortunately this has not happened. Undocumented migrants, when we have more than 1 million of them in Malaysia, unfortunately are also not covered by any laws and therefore not protected. In the case of the electronics sector, it also hasn't been easy, but for the first time, the government actually agreed for a regional union, regional being in the north or south or east or west of Malaysia. So in terms of the rights for migrant workers, there has been some updates. Recently, the Social Security has been extended to documented migrants, but it still leaves out the undocumented migrants. Migrants are also not the beneficiary of any of the assistance from the stimulus packages. We have also seen a huge problem in terms of the overcrowding of the housing in the housing areas for migrant workers. And the Malaysian government has taken some steps to make sure that this situation improve, where every migrant workers are now entitled to a single bed mattress instead of sharing it with other migrant workers. So, and then lastly, the International Labour Organization have also stated that we need a better and less bureaucratic stimulus packages, and the social protections have to be more rapid and sets minimum parameters for extension on scheme for more beneficiaries. So with that, I would like to conclude, and I would just like to point out that there are a few cross-cutting themes that has been emphasized more than once throughout this week. One is that COVID-19 have made us realize our lack of resilience and how we need to do something different, and there's no business as usual. This is because the new normal is being constantly shaped by us, and if we do not want our new normal to become the old normal again, we need to do things differently. More importantly, we need to solve the issue of inequality, and we need to stress that the state have a very big role to play in this. Trends such as automations and the rise of economy is already happening and is only going to be accelerated by COVID-19. These disruptions are both opportunities and also risks, and we need to shape them in a way where it can bring social goods. There's also a need for the rethink on educations and skills training. Education is no longer about getting a degree, because having a degree is no longer a guarantee to jobs in the future, and the future of work will require more flexibility. So economic insecurity is especially prevalent among youth, gig workers, migrant workers, and women. And there is no doubt that we need stronger and more inclusive social protection system. Finally, we need a renewed concept of work, where we will have a better conversation around the issues of the value of work, dignity, quality, and productivity. Last but not least, we also need a more stakeholder approach, where everyone has a say in the discourse and dialogues, instead of a shareholder approach in managing our economy. So that is all from me. I hope that I am doing justice to all the very, very good points that are made in this conference. And I would like to thank all of you for staying with us until the end of this conference. So I think now I would like to pass the time to Senator Liu Chintao, who is formerly the Deputy Defense Minister and also the board chairman of REFSA, to give his closing remark.
Thank you, Ivy. Thanks for this very comprehensive summary of the week-long conference. And I would like to thank everyone who have been helping out to make this conference possible, and to the speakers who are with us this afternoon. I think when we think about the future of work, it is about thinking about the future of capitalism. We need to rethink capitalism, because otherwise we will not be able to rethink the future or think about the future of work. We are now at a once in a century crisis, health crisis. There has not been such a major worldwide pandemic since 1918 to 1919. We are now at the worst economic crisis since the global depression, the Great Depression. We are now perhaps in the world's most serious political crisis since the World War II. So we need to rethink how we deal with the world. And as pointed out by Jomo and Jayati on Monday, this 40 years of neoliberalism, or in the Asian context and United States context, I think this 40 to 50 years of outsourcing of work from the developed country to our part of the world will require a lot of rethinking. US started outsourcing in a massive way from about late 60s onwards. And of course that exacerbated by the 90s, and after China joined the WTO in 2001, the entire manufacturing industry was practically moved to China and our part of the world, the Asian part of the world. But this has resulted in a situation where today we have now witnessed how serious when jobs are no longer there, and when the middle class, entire middle class in US disappeared, and we are seeing the political consequences of 50 years of outsourcing to our part of the world. Now, that outsourcing has grown our economy, and brought prosperity, but that has also stagnated. That has also stagnated and is tested in this COVID crisis. We are now having a situation where with the disappearance of US middle class, countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, to a lesser extent the Philippines, and other parts of Asian countries will have nowhere to export to. And that is a serious question that we have to deal with. And anything that actually moves us forward will need to be based on some form of solidarity between our part of the world, the workers in our part of the world, and the workers in places like United States, Europe, Australia, and other first world countries. Only with some form of basic standards for workers that is not jeopardizing and not threatening their well-being, and that pay them decently, recognize the needs of dignified works, both in the United States, Europe, Australia, and in our part of the world. Only with that sort of basis on an almost equal standard of living, recognizing the need for dignified work on both sides, that we can actually create a sustainable economy for the world. Now, for the Asian economy, and particularly for Malaysian economy, we have been on this low-pay work for the last 3 or 4 decades of outsourcing. We have suppressed wages. The state sees that its only responsibility in the economy is to facilitate foreign direct investment into Malaysia, and now forgetting that actually why foreign direct investment was brought into Malaysia and Asia in the first place was to create employment. Today, even that social function of bringing employment into our part of the world, into our society, has been forgotten. That originally it was meant to create better paid jobs in our society. And indeed, there was a time where jobs created by foreign direct investment in the 70s, in the 80s were indeed better jobs, better paid than what were available in the society. But that has been forgotten. So we are in a situation where the state does nothing apart from facilitating investment, but investment doesn't bring jobs. So we are on a low pay model. Therefore, we have a huge number of Malaysians leaving the country, working in Singapore and other parts of the world as cheap labor. So we have a huge population of migrant workers in Malaysia being exploited. Yet at the same time, there's a huge number of Malaysians who work in Singapore as cheap labor. And that is a question that we will have to deal with. And this COVID crisis has exacerbated the problem because those who are in Singapore, particularly those who are in services sector in Singapore, are now facing reckoning because the Singapore services sector are shutting down. For example, people who work at the Singapore airport, people who work at hotels in Singapore. These Malaysians will have to come back to Malaysia, and we do not have enough jobs that can pay even half of the rate of what they get in Singapore. I think the same cycle, same question is being faced by the Filipino state, by other states in the region, which are Bangladesh, which has a huge migrant labor force and which has actually been very dependent on remittances over the years. Now, these will be the challenges that we will have to face, our societies will have to face in the years to come as a result of the COVID crisis, and also, of course, as a result of years of not creating decent pay, decent jobs for our society. Now, the state needs to think about how to play a more activist role. The state cannot sit back and watch millions of people living under low income, low pay, or see millions of people with underemployment. Even if they are employed in many of our societies, they are underpaid, underemployed, and not living a decent life even if they work very hard. So the state cannot continue to see this forever. And the state needs to take a more activist role. And I think for many of you who know the work of Mazzucato, I think Mazzucato is influencing a lot more people on this idea that the state has to be play an activist role, and the state has to think of completing certain mission in the economy. The growth should not be for its own sake, and the economy is not just about growth. The economy has to have achieved a certain objective, certain common good, and the economy or the intervention of the state in the economy is about to achieve a certain mission. Moonshot in the 60s by Kennedy, and recently I saw that Prince William talked about Earthshot, how to create a situation where within 10 years there are enough consciousness, enough innovation to achieve climate goals. I think these are the things that the state will have to think about, and particularly there needs to be sufficient decent pay job in order to create sufficient income, and with income create demand. Without jobs, there will not be income. And I am not a subscriber of UBI. I don't particularly agree that the universal part of UBI, because I think ultimately some basic income for some section of the society, particularly the vulnerable groups, will be important. But more importantly is to create employment that generate income, generate decent pay jobs, in order to create demand, particularly domestic demand. And with demand, therefore there will be a more healthier economy that will work for everyone. And the economy should achieve green objective. The economy should also achieve health objective. So the role of the state is to mobilize resources in our society, mobilize societal resources. I think there's too much debates about fiscal policy, too much attention about austerity in the last 12 years since the global financial crisis. It is very unfortunate that Europe, went on this austerity drive after global financial crisis, and resulting in even more broken economy in our society. Now, what is needed is to think about how to mobilize societal resources to achieve the mission that we all agreed to. Therefore, it's not just about government investment, but government play the role of a catalyst. So government is not just, it's not the debate about deficit, but it's the idea of whether government can organize societal resources, create a framework for both public and private investment into a common vision that we all agree. It is also about rethinking the role of the corporation, as pointed out by Ivy and also throughout the conference. For instance, what Davos is now talking about, stakeholder economy that actually look at the environment, actually think about how the corporation can assist or help customer, workers, as well as shareholder, and not just shareholder. I think that is an important way of rethinking capitalism. Now, fundamentally, what was the problem with neoliberal economy? Neoliberal economy tried to abolish politics. Now, when I say politics, I don't mean politics as in politics of personality, politics of who becomes a prime minister, as in our case now. But I mean politics as in the public interest, public interest about people. Now, I was joking, I say Singapore is now learning the hard way that actually there is politics. Now, the economy cannot function without public interest, without politics, and it is important to realize that the economy is not just for economic sake, the economy is not just for growth sake, the economy has an objective, and we must agree to a certain objective, and therefore, with all these ideas, I think we hopefully we can build back better. We can think about the future of work in the context of rethinking capitalism, and rethinking capitalism, rethinking of work in the new normal, and let's work towards a great reset. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chin Tong, for ending the conference with such a high note, energizing us. That indeed, there's a lot of work to do, but we can do it together when we have solidarity with each other. So with that, I would like to conclude the conference, and I would like to thank you once again very much for joining us throughout this week. I'm informed that some of you have asked for the presentation slides. Refsa will be sending them to you by email, and we will also be uploading them on our website, so do stay tuned. We will also be having a breakout sessions like in the past 4 days. So if any of you would like to stay back and have some chit chat with our speakers, this will be more casual and free flow. Do use the raise hand function at the bottom panel, and our admin will add you to the panelist group. So once again, thank you very much. Congratulations. And we will see you again in the future soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, great discussion. Thank you very much. You touched on so many different issues that it's difficult now to pick one, but I would be interested to pick just one of the things that Chin Tong mentioned and you touched also on in your presentations. The question where to export if there is no export market anymore left. I mean, Hidayat, you mentioned the risk of having a race to the bottom investment incentive kind of competition. So having said this, where do you see the employment effects of an RCEP if it's ratified this year? And what do you think about the scenario of having a China ASEAN industrial region being pushed and boosted by this current economic crisis? Is that the possible scenario that this region is moving to? Or I mean, to have, of course, a more stronger focus on domestic demand is probably the long-term way to go. But for the midterm, do you think that this tectonic shift will take place in the years to come? That because of the biggest trade bloc of RCEP and then ASEAN and China growing closer together, the new engine of trade and growth will simply move to a bigger China +1, as it has been called in one of the previous sessions?
I think that's a question for Chin Tong, right?
Anyone who wants to chip in. Yeah. Hi, Tong.
I just spoke too much.
Can I add something there?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. No, look, I fully agree with Jin Tong. You know, I really appreciate you made a couple of, I mean, everything you said, I fully agree with. The analysis is exactly right. And that foreign direct investment, all the policies around it used to be part of an industrial policy of creating employment, but also transferring technology. You know, and the kind of foreign direct investment that countries can attract right now in the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression is what kind of, China's in a very deep financial crisis. And what we have to remember about a financial crisis is that you either take the impact of that crisis or you displace it. You displace a financial crisis spatially, meaning push it to another place, or temporarily, delay it for another time. So 2008 was a delayed financial crisis for the United States, delayed about 8 years. The crisis in Mexico is the United States' displacement of their financial crisis south. China has a financial crisis. I think RCEP would just open up all of ASEAN to this displacement of their financial crisis. I think this is a huge problem. Secondly, all transnational companies coming out of China are backed by the government. And their priority right now is food security. They're buying up meat and dairy companies in Australia and New Zealand. They're panicked extremely. Now, we know the land grabbing has occurred, but right now they're buying up dairy companies in New Zealand. They're extremely worried about the food crisis that's coming. It will be the worst in 50 years, according to the UN. And I think if we focus on food security and the right to food and nutrition as a key issue, I believe you'll actually be able to stall this RCEP on that basis. The jobs issue, yes, but food, nutrition in a global crisis like this, there are countries in our region with only 6 months of food supplies left in an emergency. And it's impossible now to tell us we should just open up and have more subsidized rice from Vietnam, vegetables and apples from the US. It just makes no sense. And the Chinese government is already building massive banana plantations throughout Southeast Asia. I mean, this is just a food security policy backed by the government. It has nothing to do with free trade. The final point would be that, you know, I think that it's not just an opportunity for these policies that Jin Tong is talking about. I don't think we have a choice. I don't think historically, the moment we're in, I don't think it's much of a debate now, or it shouldn't be. The fact that it's a debate is costing lives. We need massive government intervention to support domestic spending, to support incomes and livelihoods, and absolutely domestic spending is going to drive recovery. It has to be the resilience. The fact that the export model is so fragile, you know, all of the growth since the Asian financial crisis in 1998 is gone in 6 months. It's gone in 6 months, 22 years ago, it's just gone. So what was that? Was that growth? Can we still call it growth? How can it be gone in 6 months? And so whatever we do going forward, a more resilient economy, domestic spending based on decent wages, good incomes. I agree about the universal basic income, but we're under tremendous political pressure, you know, to include everyone. And, you know, but I get your point. It is social protection for those who need it. Better jobs. Our members want to work. You know, I have members, and please, sorry for going on too long, but I have union members who have been given a choice of redundancy. And our slogan for World Tourism Day, by the way, we lost 3,000 members at Genting, you know. I'll give that as an example. So they lay off 2,818 of our rank and file members at Genting Resorts World. Then I think 105 executive staff. That's our membership. 4 weeks later, when they reopened for business, there was a labor shortage, and our remaining members are doing 3 times as much work. These people are not redundant. It's just a cost saving. It's just a cost saving, very short-sighted. And when we see layoffs in hotels that are taking place, as an example, we're arguing with the government, this is the time for these companies to invest in a recovery, prepare for the future. Our members are ready. And so our slogan, which is a bit clumsy, resonated on World Tourism Day. We're not redundant, we're ready. So I think we really have to challenge the idea that somehow people are redundant. How could you be redundant in, as Jintong said, the worst health crisis in 100 years, the worst economic crisis since the 1930s? And I take it very seriously when someone with your background, sir, says the worst political crisis since World War II. I understand the implication of that. But, you know, in that, no one's redundant. We're just ready. Our members are on standby, and the government has to invest in their being ready for a recovery, because they will not only be workers, they'll be consumers too.
Very interesting ideas. I agree with what you say. In fact, I'm pushing some of our state governments, and also hopefully federal government will listen to me or listen to us in thinking about creating green jobs. We are very slow in terms of green technology. Although we have the largest solar plants in the world, but how do we actually create a model in which the government be the catalyst and work with the banks, work with the private contractors to create energy conservation buildings, energy efficient buildings, and through that sort of contracting, the government may not have to necessarily have to come up with a lot more money, but the point is that you create a new way of doing things, and you create new jobs in those sectors, and which will benefit the economy into the future. I think investment into healthcare jobs, care jobs, preparing Malaysia to become an aging society. I think these are jobs that we can create, we can try. Creating more care jobs for childcare will also help women to get into the workforce. So I think we will need to keep on telling people that, as you say, the workers are not redundant, but actually it's the state, it's the society that has not put enough thought into creating jobs that will help the society to complete some missions for our society.
Yeah, but also I think if I may respond to that, to give greater value to those jobs. So all of the jobs in waste recycling, you know, pollution reduction, all of these jobs, for example, you know, you'll see hotel resort workers in Phuket and Bali cleaning beaches and cleaning up the environment, but no one considers that work. Yet it is so vital, not only for the recovery of tourism, but for the environment. I think that we have to it's not just about job creation and the government spending more money. It's about recognizing we have a lot of existing jobs in society that help us tackle climate change and restore the environment. It should be given more value, that's all, as a green job, and recognize it as such.
I agree with you. Good points.
Are there any more other questions from participants who want to use the opportunity now in this more or less private setting we have? Any questions left? Maybe from you?
I know. Just want to do a reflection because of what Chin Tong and Hidayat have said about decent job, recognizing green jobs, and hopefully promoting higher pay for workers. And what does it mean for government? What does it mean for policy? Because like in the case of Malaysia, I used to work with the Central Bank of Malaysia. I've seen the government implemented minimum wage as the floor, and with several rounds of revision as well. And the central bank, we publish articles about living wage, so that it promotes a level of wage which promotes comfortable living. And so that's above, one step better than minimum wage. And that has been well received by the unions, of course, but we've seen a lot of opposition from employers, especially with the rounds of revision regarding minimum wage. And I think these are the bare minimum that the government should do. But beyond this, what kind of intervention should government do further to promote higher income? I mean, it's been an issue that's been long discussed since my whole 10-year career in the central bank. But yeah, what else to do? I mean, yeah, to realistically move forward from here. Yeah. That's my line of thought.
I always think that minimum wage is the bare minimum that we can do for workers, but actually it's not sufficient. And very often in Malaysia, people will talk about brain drain, people will talk about trying to capture the top level of workers who are going overseas. But I hope we can recognize that actually we have 500,000 Malaysians working as cheap labor in Singapore. Many of them are working with a salary of less than 2,000 Sing dollar, which is about 6,000 ringgit. How do we create jobs that pay 3,000 to 4,000 ringgit? For them, actually, they are not. I ask many of them, I say, how much are you prepared to stay home? I mean, what sort of salary level that you're prepared to stay in Malaysia? So I just need to get, say, about 3,000 or 4,000 ringgit to begin with. But most of the labor job in Malaysia are actually paying a salary of, say, 1,000, 1,005. Minimum wage is 1,002. So how do we create jobs that pay at the level which is, say, a semi-skilled job, pay at, say, 3,000 or 4,000 ringgit, 2/3 of what they will get in Singapore? But how to achieve that that sort of a level? I think I have a different view about automation. I think actually automation and labor saving what they call technology, in our case, could be a helpful type of arrangement. Say, for example, if we can reduce certain sector from, say, hiring 10 person in one job, with technology, with productivity gain, you hire, say, 1 or 2 person for a job that used to be done by 10 person. Then you can actually raise salary at the bottom very quickly, rapidly for Malaysians, and also through which increase productivity and push the society to higher technological advances. So I don't know how to square this circle, but I think it's important to work at the bottom. And once we can transform jobs at the bottom, then the question of minimum wage is not as relevant as it is now. But unfortunately, not many people are thinking along this line. We did try when I was in Penang, some of our colleagues, we tried in one local council. In that local council, it has always been paying contractors which are connected politically to handle garbage collection. But we were able to remove all the contractors in 5 years' time when the contracts are expired, and hire Malaysians. So we hire about 2,500 Malaysians, and each of them were paid between 1,400 and 1,900 ringgit, which is not a lot, but the take home was about 2,000 ringgit, 1,900 to 2,000 ringgit. For a northern semi-urban area, it was still a decent pay. And each time when they recruit, thousands of people queue up for those jobs. So for the point that Malaysians do not like 3D jobs, I don't buy it. But how do we create jobs that actually pay decently, and with skill, with semi-skill, with technology, how do we create that is something that we may have to work on.
Yep, Definitely agree. And let's take it one step further. I agree with what you said. And I want to bring in the point that Ani made as well, whereby as a country, we've put in a lot of incentives to encourage companies to automate, do precisely what you said. But again, 98.5% of our companies are SMEs. And I just wonder what the take-up of these incentives are, because in the past, they have been rather poor. And it's really sort of a mindset issue. You can encourage them, you can incentivize them, but if experience is anything to go by, it's been really hard to nudge SMEs to take this step. You might have a few that would step up and do it, but a huge majority are still lagging behind, which is precisely why we are in this situation. And it's been years, even decades, I would say. So I think where we stand right now is what else can we do to nudge the SMEs further beyond incentives? Do we need a different type of incentives? Because automation addresses current companies. On the other domain, we are trying to attract new companies as well, FDI, that's what Hidayat said. We're trying to encourage a different type of FDI that are not as labor intensive, that are more value based. So we can do that, but on the other hand, we have a huge chunk of existing companies. What do we do with them, right? And I think probably a new set of incentives, or I'm not sure where are we in this discussion when it comes to parliament, when it comes to cabinet within Malaysia, but maybe a different approach is needed.
I have been scolded by many SMEs on the questions of foreign labor. Each time I advocate that we should have less foreign labor and we should try to pay Malaysian better in order and therefore replace foreign workers. You will get SME saying, how could you remove, because for many SME, the only thing they wanted the state the only incentive they were looking to the state to provide them is cheap labor, cheap foreign labor. And I would say that we will have to handhold SME, but not necessarily just incentive, but actually reduce this what they call the possibility of having cheap labor coming into the country, and through which force change. And interestingly, recently, if you look at the case of Top Glove, eventually they were forced to pay, or their contractor were forced to pay a much higher pay to foreign workers in their in their company because of the pressure from United States and from other countries. That is a very interesting case, because at some point when foreign workers are expensive, if you follow proper labor requirement, then the incentive of having foreign workers is no longer necessarily the choice. That perhaps hopefully can equalize the situation.
Then maybe it's time to bring back EPF's. Maybe it's time to bring back EPF's EPF's 2020 budget proposal, which is the Malaysian network. Because one of the components of its local network. Sorry, Ani, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to take on the point of what Chin Tong said about Top Glove. The issue there was actually in the year 2018, Top Glove had come under scrutiny even from the government of Malaysia, because there was a lot of issues raised from the European Union, where they had identified there's a lot of violations in terms of the recruitment fee, and also the working conditions, the housing environment. So there was a lot of violations. And at that time in 2018, the government actually was also thinking of putting together an audit team. Usually the government sends labor inspectors into these companies to see what is the working conditions like and stuff like that. But you know that we have a very limited number of labor inspectors, and sometimes what the labor inspectors will say is semua memuaskan, everything is satisfactory. So the government was actually also considering whether we should put a group together of an audit team to go in. While the discussion was going on, there was a change of government. And in terms of Top Glove, the payment that Chin Tong is referring to is the recruitment fee, because currently the code of conduct, the code of conduct for MNCs are that migrant workers do not pay a recruitment fee. So it's zero recruitment fee. Companies like Apple, HP have, they call Electronics Industries Code of Conduct, where one of the code is zero recruitment fee. If the employer wants to bring in the worker, he has to undertake the recruitment fee. And if the worker is already here, and if he has paid the recruitment fee, then the company is obliged to pay back to the workers. And I think, if I'm not sure, if I'm not mistaken, it's a few millions, which now Top Glove is, I think it's 40 million, that the Top Glove will have to pay back to the workers who had paid a recruitment fee to come into the country. That's one point. And then the point that you made about the SMEs, I've been into, I used to work with the ILO, and I've been in discussions, very difficult discussions with SMEs. And we actually come out with a migraine. And you know, they start, especially to the issue of foreign workers. There's two things, yeah. And I double checked the issues raised by SMEs and with the MEF as well. One, the SMEs are very upset with the ILO for actually talking about labor standards. They said that, you know, it's because of you people who come in here saying that we need to comply with labor standards, we have problems. So they still seem to be very into hiring migrant labor, which, I've checked. So I asked the MEF, you know, the Malaysian Employers Federation, why is this the case when the HRDF, the Human Resource Development Fund, provides funds to SMEs to automate? I'm not saying that's the way we should be going. And, you know, but if because Malaysians also need the work, I'm not saying that, but there are funds allocated, and why is the SMEs not leveraging on the funds? So the reply came from the employers saying that the SMEs are comfortable in hiring cheap labor. So, but then as, you know, with, that's why my last point was, you know, inclusive and a better response to the management of migrant labor. So where in terms of fair recruitment, you have to ensure there's a zero recruitment fee. And so maybe those things will put some kind of pressure on companies.
Can I jump in at this point again?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Just shortly? Briefly. So I just think I'll give an example. We have a real challenge with transnational companies operating in Malaysia that employ migrant workers in job positions that are actually covered by the collective agreement. Forklift operators, a very common problem. We have this ongoing fight with them about you're violating the CBA. Local workers should be doing, our members should be doing the forklift operating, not foreign migrant workers, migrant workers. But what's really interesting is that if you look at the cost, it's not cheaper. With the agency and everything, it's not cheaper. But what it is, the difference is the vulnerability. Because when it comes down to it, they said, your members don't want to do this job. And that's why we hired foreign workers. I talked to my members in Malaysia, you know what they don't want? They want to do the job, but they can't find out in the last 30 minutes of their shift, they have to do another 3 hours. That's what they object to. So when the global management of this company said to me, your members are not flexible enough, what he meant was due to the mismanagement of scheduling, which is a huge problem in all manufacturing in all of these countries, which causes stress. At the end of your shift of 8 hours, the supervisor will say, you need to do another 3 hours. Our members won't do it. They have family commitments, they're gonna go home, they'll say no. But the foreign workers, the migrant workers don't, they can't. There's a bus taking them home, they stay in the dormitory, and they're vulnerable because, you know, it's a 2-year contract. So they say, yes, that's the flexibility. And there's no cost saving, but you extract then 4 more hours out of people that our local members just won't do. They have families to get back to. So one of the things is really to regulate that about shifts and hours and find out what it is that makes the job unattractive. I agree with Jin Tong. 3 companies recently we dealt with just before the pandemic told me they couldn't find local workers. And I said, prove to me you tried. Where are the advertisements? Where's the recruitment? How did you explain this job? And of course, they put a banner in front of the factory no one could see for a couple of weeks and then told the Labor Department we couldn't find anyone. People want these jobs, people need these jobs, but you have to make them decent jobs. And they can afford it. So just quickly, the last point sorry, Shin Yao Yin said about that. I fully agree. But in some ways, that wage and the wages that we need to get is also about living costs, isn't it? So there are some part of the living costs that are human rights. And one of the things the government says to recognize right now is that the right to education, the right to housing, the right to food and nutrition is a human right. So access to affordable food, housing, education, if guaranteed through a different way, what kind of pressure does that put on the wages in terms of what is correctly called a living wage? For us, we see a living wage is just a wage you need to access your human rights, to live with dignity, decently, not the minimum wage, you're right. But so that means in the economics of it, if you make the housing, education, and those other, and food and nutrition, good food and nutrition, and healthcare affordable, and therefore healthcare free, doesn't that reduce that pressure? Vast majority of my members in manufacturing, it's the fear of getting sick when you're retired in the future, or having unwell elderly members of your family, reaching the end of your insurance. That's what puts people in poverty in our membership in ASEAN who are in fairly good manufacturing jobs. The difference between a good job and sending your kids to college and getting them a better life than you is whether a family member gets sick, long-term illness. That'll put you in debt and poverty. So if healthcare was free, supported by the government, one thing gone. You see what I mean? So there's a pressure on this desire for, that's endless. If we're talking about luxury items and so on, that's one thing, but people can't afford their basic rights. And I think that's what's driving people to go to Malaysia and Australia. It's a huge problem. United Workers Union dealing with students from Malaysia coming, working on farms, protecting their rights. And there's a lot of them trapped right now, but they're seeking an amnesty for those students at the moment to stay and continue to work, but to work in good conditions, right? But, I believe it. I'm stuck very far from home. I believe most people want to go home. Of course you want to work at home, but you've got to have the decent wages and jobs to do it. And I don't think employers I've met in Malaysia have made enough effort to make that a decent job. Final point on SME is maybe look at value extraction. It's the retailers and supermarkets are pulling 55% off the top of profits. If you're in the supply chain as an SME of a big retailer or supermarket in Malaysia, that's where the money is. They're extracting value and putting pressure on you. I don't think it justifies saying we need to exploit foreign work, migrant labor, cheap migrant labor, but where's the pressure coming from? And I think part of the financial pressure they're facing, other than the banks, is the retail concentration over the last 15 years has been tremendous. Just to get to market, maybe the e-commerce is a good chat, but even that becomes monopolized very quickly. So it's just worth looking at the financial pressure and value extraction. And we're having a huge fight with bananas, for example. Supermarkets are taking 55% off every banana in profit. And we can't get decent wages for banana workers in the Philippines because of it. Sorry, a bit long, but I just wanted to throw that in.
But extremely interesting, because I think everyone can feel that you are really dealing with the needs of workers on a daily basis, because you are so aware what the current challenges and needs are. So I think that is a very good thought that we can take, that a living wage is simply a wage to realize human rights. I think that is something that applies to every country worldwide, but is not realized yet. So I take that maybe as a final positive and encouraging note. Before I would like to thank all of you, panelists, moderator, and also the participants for your precious time on a Friday evening. We really appreciate that you spent your time with us and with the audience. I hope that can be continued. But I would also like to thank REFSA and the REFSA team in Kuala Lumpur, who have hosted this web conference during the course of the week. At the beginning of this year, we were actually planning an offline meeting, and I mean, I would love to meet all of you, of course, face to face in Kuala Lumpur, enjoy some good Malaysian food, and enjoy also the sidewalks in Kuala Lumpur. But somehow, yeah, in this exceptional year, we had to change the agenda without knowing if this idea of having a virtual web conference for a week long would work out at all. So at least for me, that was a kind of pioneer experience that Refstar was doing here. I mean, you can make your own judgment, but I'm very happy without any social media advertisement, because we want to limit it to our network. We had more than 300 or more or less 300 participants in the course of the week. There were economists, prominent economists, there were politicians, there were representatives of employer association, academia, and of course, last but not least, also union representative for sharing experience and developing ideas, how we deal with this future of capitalism and future of work that we would like to shape. I learned a lot, and I think we set a quite good example of the future of work. But of course, I would like that this was something that we can also overcome, to meet only offline, and next time we are able to meet face to face again and continue this discussion. So thank you very much again. Has been a pleasure, and yeah, I hope to see you soon outside of the online world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
The pleasure is ours, and we will be sharing all our slides and presentations over the week, and the video recordings as well with all the participants. So keep an eye out on your inbox. Yim, you have been joining us for every single session. That's very good participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Salam from UK.
Hidayat, Annie, thank you for having us and spending your time as well. So Sergio, we should close the session then, I guess.